Hey guys, tonight, I want you to take a deep breath, settle into your pillows, maybe dim the lights a little bit more, and just let the world grow quiet around you. Before we begin, if you enjoy these long, sleepy history journeys, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps this calm little corner of the internet keep growing. Now, just relax, let your breathing fall into a slow rhythm, and let me take you back, very far back, into a world where candlelight flickered on cold stone walls, and the destinies of entire nations could shift in a single night. Tonight's story drifts into the strange, shadowed corridors of Renaissance Italy, into a night whispered about in royal letters, gossiped across courts, and sealed into diplomatic records with an uneasiness that still feels alive centuries later. It is the story of a young duchess, a marriage arranged not for love, not even for companionship, but for the delicate and dangerous balance of power between dukes, kings, and the future of Italy itself. And it is the story of a ritual, witnessed by people who should never have been in that room, a ceremony that had to be seen, documented, and confirmed 3 times before dawn. But we're not going to rush there. No, we're going to float slowly through those halls, through the quiet cities of Italy, where politics and secrets lived in every shadow. Because history doesn't happen suddenly. It moves like water, quietly filling the cracks, shaping events long before anyone knows a turning point is coming. So let your mind drift now, far back, to a soft evening in the late 1400s, when the air carried the scent of warm stone cooling after a long day, and distant bells echoed from cathedral towers. Italy was not yet a single country. It was a puzzle of duchies, republics, kingdoms, and tiny city-states, each pulsing with ambition. Every marriage was a negotiation, every handshake a careful gamble, and every heir a potential shift in the fragile balance of power. And in this world, a young woman's life could become a political instrument before she even understood the game being played. Our story begins with a girl who grew up in a grand palace where nothing really belonged to her, not her days, not her future, not even the man she would one day marry. She was raised in a setting of marble corridors and embroidered tapestries, but her life was woven by advisors, diplomats, and ambitious relatives who watched Europe like a chessboard. Her destiny was chosen for her long before she ever set eyes on her future husband. She was known for her quiet grace, her education, and her ability to navigate courtly expectations without betraying frustration or fear. People wrote about her composure, about how she could sit through hours of political discussions with a polite stillness that impressed ambassadors and unnerved her enemies. They also wrote quietly, in letters never meant for public eyes, that she seemed almost too calm, too resigned, as if she had long ago understood that her body and future were pieces in a larger negotiation. Italy at this time was tangled in alliances like threads knotted inside each other. France wanted control, Spain wanted influence, the Papal States wanted obedience, and the independent duchies, like the one our young bride came from, wanted survival. And so, a marriage was arranged. Not because the bride and groom had affection for one another, not because their temperaments matched, not even because their families held ancient ties. It was arranged because if this marriage succeeded, it was legitimate, recognized, and witnessed. Then territories could be combined, enemies could be neutralized, and a future heir could secure the map of Italy for decades to come. But legitimacy required evidence, and evidence, in those days, had to be seen. That is how the Duchess found herself walking toward a dimly lit bedchamber on a night she would remember until her last breath. A night when witnesses gathered outside heavy wooden doors, listening for proof that the marriage had been consummated. A night that would not end after a single confirmation. It would continue, demanded, inspected, and recorded, 3 times before dawn. But before we reach that impossible scene, we must sink deeper into the world around her. Imagine, for a moment, the palace itself. It stood like a sleeping giant over a river whose surface reflected lanterns in wavering lines. The palace was a maze of echoing halls where every step seemed to carry secrets. Courtiers moved with soft footsteps, not wishing to disturb the politics thick in the air. Servants in muted clothing kept their heads lowered, knowing that one overheard whisper could alter their fate. And outside, in the narrow streets, people lit candles in small windows as the night deepened. Inside the Duchess's private chamber, the ladies-in-waiting fussed over her gown, its fabric heavy with embroidery. Their hands trembled slightly, not from fear of her, but from fear of what this night represented. They knew that this marriage was not simply a joining of two people. It was a test, an inspection, an obligation commanded by powerful men sitting in distant chambers, sipping wine while they debated taxation, borders, and alliances. She sat silently as they brushed her hair, the strokes slow and rhythmic, like the gentle movement of waves. But her gaze was somewhere far away, drifting beyond the palace walls, beyond the river, beyond the expectations on her shoulders. She had always understood her role. She had been prepared for it since childhood, but understanding something and living it, not in theory. But in a room with witnesses waiting were two very different things. The groom, too, walked toward his fate with a tense formality. His advisers whispered last-minute instructions, as if anything said now could ease the weight of political responsibility pressed onto him. He was young, proud, and perhaps more nervous than he would ever admit. He understood that this night would be recorded by scribes, read by ambassadors, and discussed by courts across Europe. The witnesses chosen carefully for their status and trustworthiness gathered discreetly near the chamber, where the ceremony would take place. They were not there for pleasure, nor for scandal, though many would later joke uncomfortably about the discomfort of that night. They were there to ensure that Italy's future rested on unquestionable legitimacy. This was how dynasties were secured. This was how territories were won without spilling blood. This was how a duchess became a political symbol instead of a person. As the hour grew late, the palace quieted. Torches burned lower, flickering gently against stone walls painted with frescoes of gods, saints, and mythic heroes figures who, unlike the mortals living beneath them, seemed untouched by the strange rituals of human politics. The air cooled, carrying the faint scent of wax and lavender from the duchess's chamber. And then, at last, a soft knock signaled that it was time. But we're not going to rush ahead. Let the moments stretch. Let the tension settle. Let the story breathe. Because in bedtime history, we drift slowly, letting every detail anchor us deeper into the past. In the next part, we will step into the dim candlelit corridor where witnesses waited, and begin the slow, strange unfolding of the night that had to be verified 3 times before dawn. The corridor outside the chamber was unusually still, as if the palace itself were holding its breath. Candles burned in tall iron holders, their light trembling with the faintest draught that wandered through the stone passageways. The witnesses stood quietly, each pretending to study the floor or the carvings on the wall, though all of them were thinking the same thing, that tonight, dignity and decorum had been pushed aside by necessity. They were men of rank, chosen for their titles and political neutrality. Some were bishops, accustomed to rituals but not this kind. Some were old noblemen, their eyes dimmed by years of court service. And some were young, ambitious, careful to hide their discomfort beneath an expression of practiced formality. But whether old or young, experienced or untested, each had been summoned because the future of a duchy and perhaps all of Italy rested on what they could truthfully report before sunrise. The duchess approached the chamber with her ladies walking a careful step behind her. The rustle of her gown sounded like rain brushing over silk, a soft, steady whisper that followed her through the dim corridor. She kept her head slightly lowered, not in shame but in controlled composure and art she had been taught long before she learned anything else. Her face was serene, carved from the same quiet strength that had carried her through years of political grooming. When she reached the doorway she paused, not dramatically, not fearfully, but with a stillness that felt like a breath held between two worlds. The life she had lived until now, and the life that awaited her on the other side of that threshold. Her fingers brushed the carved wooden frame, tracing the patterns etched by artisans decades before. The cool texture grounded her for a moment, pulling her out of the swirl of expectations pressing in on her. Her groom waited inside already, standing near the bed with its heavy velvet canopy and embroidered sheets. He straightened his posture as she entered, trying to appear confident, though the flicker in his eyes betrayed nerves. He bowed slightly to her hand, acknowledgement not of romance, but of shared weight. Both of them were stepping into a ritual older than their own lineages, a ritual crafted by kings and popes to ensure alliances could not be disputed. The door closed gently behind her, and the witnesses settled into their positions outside. They would not enter unless summoned. Their duty was not to invade the couple's privacy, but to confirm what tradition demanded, proof that the marriage had been physically sealed. Inside, the room glowed with the warm golden light of candles placed carefully around the space. Shadows stretched long across the floor, reaching toward the corners like quiet observers. The air was scented faintly with myrrh and rosewater, a mixture chosen not for romance but to calm the mind and soften the nerves. The Duchess moved with an almost dreamlike calm, her steps slow and measured. She had been trained for poise in moments far more public than this, but none had carried the same personal cost. She knew that histories would be written about tonight. Letters would be exchanged between France and Spain, between Rome and Florence, describing what had occurred in this chamber. But none of those accounts would capture the quiet human truth of the moment, the mix of duty, apprehension, and resignation unfolding beneath candlelight. The groom approached her gently, not wanting to startle her. He spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of expectation he shared with her. They exchanged a few quiet words, nothing ceremonial, nothing recorded, words spoken as two young people facing a task shaped by forces far larger than themselves. Words that would never be preserved in any archive, though perhaps they were the most honest part of the entire night. Outside, the witnesses shifted quietly in the corridor. The youngest among them glanced occasionally toward the door, his breath shallow with tension. He had expected many formal duties in his career, but this one unsettled him, yet he understood its importance deeply. One unconfirmed marriage could unravel years of diplomacy. Time moved strangely in that hallway. Minutes felt stretched, slow, almost suspended. The flames of the candles rose and dipped, creating a hypnotic rhythm, as if the whole palace breathed with them. And then, the moment came. A servant stepped quietly into the corridor, man chosen for discretion, and whispered to the witnesses that the first confirmation was ready to be acknowledged. The group straightened, forming a small procession. They entered the chamber with careful, measured steps, their eyes lowered respectfully. What they saw was not meant to be scandalous, but procedural, a symbolic verification, discreetly managed, done with as much dignity as the circumstances would allow. A nod from the groom, a subtle signal from the Duchess, a brief, formal acknowledgement that the marriage had been consummated as required. The witnesses bowed and withdrew, satisfied for now. But the night was far from over, because the alliance demanded not one confirmation, but three. A tradition rooted in old, rigid requirements, part superstition, part legal safeguard, part political ensurencement, to prove beyond any challenge that the union was undeniably complete. As the door closed again, the Duchess felt a shiver pass through her, not of fear, but of the weight increasing upon her. The first ritual was done, but two more lay ahead before the sun even touched the horizon. The palace outside seemed to grow quieter, as if listening. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolling the late hour drifted through the halls like a soft echo from the darkness beyond the walls. The river outside murmured against its banks, carrying the faint reflection of moonlight on its surface. Inside the chamber, the couple returned to their places, the soft whispers of movement blending into the candlelit stillness. There was no rushing, no urgency, only the slow, inevitable continuation of a night dictated by politics instead of nature. The Duchess felt her heartbeat settle into a slower rhythm. She had expected this, prepared for it, yet living through it was something else entirely. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering her resolve, letting the stillness inside her grow stronger. The groom exhaled quietly, a breath that trembled with pressure. He was young, but not naive. He understood the stakes. One failed ritual, one doubt, one whisper of uncertainty, and the entire alliance could be questioned by rival courts waiting eagerly for a weakness. Outside the windows, the night deepened. Stars appeared against the dark sky, distant and indifferent to human rituals. The candles around the room flickered softly, their light blending with the shadows in long, wavering shapes. And then, once again, the quiet preparations for the second confirmation began. Not rushed, not forced, not dramatic, just slow, solemn necessity, because history was being sealed in real time. In a room where two young lives were being bent to fit the shape of a country's ambition. The night settled deeper around the palace, a heavy velvet darkness pressing gently against the tall, arched windows. In the distance, the faint sound of water moving under the stone bridge carried through the still air, soft and steady like a slow heartbeat. Inside the chamber, everything seemed wrapped in a warm golden haze created by the candles, their flames fluttering in long, lazy arcs, as though time itself had started to drift and stretch. The Duchess sat for a moment at the edge of the bed, her hands resting lightly in her lap, the smooth fabric of her gown cascading around her like a pool of moonlit water. She felt the quiet hum of fatigue, mixed with a strange clarity. This night was unlike anything she could have imagined, yet it felt strangely inevitable, as if she had been walking toward it since childhood, without ever fully realizing it. The groom paced near the window, the soft echo of his steps barely whispering across the stone floor. He paused occasionally, looking out into the night, as though searching for courage in the darkness. His silhouette was outlined gently by candlelight, and in that dim glow, he seemed far older than he truly was, aged by the pressure of expectations rested on his shoulders. He ran a hand across his brow, exhaling slowly, trying to steady himself. Neither spoke for several minutes. They didn't need words. The quiet inside the room felt like a thick blanket around them, warming and enclosing, reassuring in its stillness. They were two young people caught inside an ancient structure of duty, and the silent, soft, restful, was the only thing that belonged to them alone. Outside the chamber doors, the witnesses waited once more. Their positions had not changed. Their expressions remained composed, though some faces showed deeper lines now, etched by the lateness of the hour and the discomfort of their task. One of the older noblemen shifted his weight very slowly. His joints stiffed from standing, while the youngest witness clasped his hands behind his back, trying not to show how nervous he felt. A faint breeze passed through the corridor, rustling the edges of their cloaks. For a moment, the candles flickered sharply, casting jittery shadows that leaped across the walls like restless spirits. Then the air stilled again, and the palace returned to its heavy quiet. Inside the room, the Duchess lifted her gaze and met the groom's eyes. There was no romance between them, no spark of affection. Yet in that moment there was something almost gentler than love and unspoken understanding. He walked toward her and offered his hand, steadying his breath in a slow rhythm that matched the soft glow surrounding them. She placed her hand in his, her fingers warm against his palm. They moved with deliberate calm, each step measured, as though the night itself demanded a slow, ceremonial pace. The candles flickered in long, graceful sweeps, illuminating the carved canopy overhead and the delicate patterns embroidered into the fabric beneath them. Everything in the room felt suspended, waiting. The second ritual began. It unfolded like the first, quietly, respectfully, without haste. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden shift, just a slow, steady continuation of what had already started. The walls themselves seemed to lean in, absorbing every whisper, every breath, every soft movement in the dim light. Outside, the witnesses waited for the sign. Their breaths moved in unison, slow and low. A few murmured prayers under their breath, not for the couple, but for the solemnity of the tradition they were upholding. They had seen many political ceremonies in their lives, but few carried the same intensity as this one, because this was not a feast, not a coronation, not a treaty. This was a human moment being turned into a political document. After a long while, footsteps approached the door again. The same servitor, discreet, quiet, man opened it, just enough to lean into the corridor. His expression revealed nothing. His training was too precise for that. He simply gave a respectful nod, the signal that the second confirmation was ready. The witnesses straightened once more, forming another small procession. The corridor felt colder now, the candles burning lower, as if hours had passed in the blink of an eye. They entered the chamber with the same careful steps as before, eyes lowered, gestures formal. The room felt warmer than the hallway, the air thick with candlelight and the faint scent of rosewater. The witnesses' presence was brief, only long enough to observe the symbolic evidence they had been summoned for. They bowed, offering respectful murmurs, and withdrew again, the door closing behind them with a soft thud that echoed through the quiet. Outside, the noblemen exchanged slow looks, not judgmental, not curious, simply acknowledging the weight of what they were participating in. Their roles were nearly complete, but not fully. They still had one more ritual to verify before dawn, and dawn felt very far away. Inside the chamber, the Duchess leaned back slightly, her breath soft and steady. A dull ache pressed beneath her calm exterior, not from pain but from the heaviness of the night's expectations. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the stillness to settle in her bones. The groom sat quietly nearby, shoulders lowered, his expression softened by exhaustion and an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. Neither of them spoke. They simply existed in the same quiet space, sharing the same slow-moving night. both aware that the third and final ritual still lay ahead like a distant mountain they had to climb. The candles burned lower, their light drifting into deeper shades of gold. The shadows on the walls stretched longer, merging, dissolving, reforming like silent witnesses of their own. The palace seemed to shrink around them, the world outside forgotten, swallowed by the quiet gravity of this chamber. And somewhere beyond the river, the bell tower marked another passing hour, its sound floating through the night like a soft wave rolling over stone streets and sleeping houses. Back inside, the Duchess opened her eyes again. She was tired, but her composure never wavered. She had been raised to endure, to adapt, to move through courtly duties with the kind of elegance that didn't crack under pressure. Tonight demanded even more of her, and she met that demand with steady, unwavering calm. The groom looked at her gently, almost apologetically. He knew what was expected next. He knew the final ritual, the one that would seal their union beyond any disputes, till awaited them. And so they both rested for a moment longer, breathing slowly, letting their strength settle, preparing to face the part of the night that would be whispered about for generations. The night had grown heavier by the time the chamber fell into its deepest quiet. Outside the windows, the moon had climbed higher, drifting behind faint clouds that passed like pale ghosts across the sky. Its light spilled gently over the rooftops and courtyards below, turning everything silver and still. Within the palace, the corridors felt almost hollow now, their long echoes muted by the weight of the hour. The witnesses waited in a kind of quiet endurance. They were tired, their backs stiff, their feet aching slightly from hours of standing, yet none complained. They knew this was not a night for comfort. It was a night for duty, unbroken line of tradition, stretching back generations. And each man standing there understood that this final confirmation, the third and last, carried more weight than the first two combined. Somewhere deeper within the halls, a servant extinguished a torch that had burned too low, its smoke curling upward like a soft veil drifting through the stones. The air felt cooler now, touched by the faintest draught sweeping in from open windows at the far end of the corridor. The candles flickered in response, their flames bending gently, casting slow-moving shadows across the walls. Those shadows seemed to sway with the breath of the palace, as if the building itself were waiting with them. Inside the chamber, the Duchess sat quietly, her posture straight but relaxed, her breath moving in slow, steady waves. Fatigue slipped into her bones like a cool fog, but it didn't weaken her grace. Instead, it softened her, made her movements slower, her presence more dissolving, more dreamlike. She had carried herself through to rituals already with a composed dignity that even the groom, despite his own noble upbringing, couldn't help admiring. The groom sat nearby, leaning slightly against the carved frame of a chair, the candlelight shaping the angles of his face with soft gold. He rubbed his hands together subtly, as though calming his nerves for the final time. He was young, but he was not untouched by the gravity of what the night represented. Every moment carried the weight of alliances, treaties, and the stability of an entire duchy. And now, the moment he had been preparing for since the sun first set was approaching. He lifted his eyes to the Duchess, studying her calm expression. She noticed the quiet question in his gaze, whether she was ready, whether they could endure this last step together. She gave the smallest nod, barely more than the soft dip of her chin. It was enough. They rose slowly, moving with the same ceremonial grace that had guided them through the earlier rituals. The candles shimmered around them as they stepped toward the bed once more, their light stretching in long trails across the walls like pale threads weaving the night together. The room felt warmer than before, almost cocoon-like, wrapping them in an intimate stillness that made even the faintest motion feel amplified. The third ritual began with no words, only soft breaths, the gentle shift of fabric, the quiet hum of obligation that filled the air. It unfolded slowly, steadily, like a tide washing over the sand, repeated, familiar, solemn. This was the ritual that mattered most, the one that would erase any doubt from political rivals, scanning for any weakness to exploit. Outside the chamber, the witnesses stood straighter, sensing the significance of this moment, though they could not see it. Their breaths moved slowly and deeply, as if they were part of the same quiet rhythm happening behind the closed doors. One of the bishops glanced briefly at the ceiling, murmuring a silent prayer not for the couple, but for the smooth completion of a night whose outcome would echo across the courts of Europe. The corridor felt colder now, the candles burning low, the hour steeped in the deep silence that comes just before dawn. A few of the younger men fought the heaviness in their eyelids, refusing to let fatigue dull their focus. This final confirmation required absolute clarity. Inside the room, time stretched again into something long and soft, like a veil floating through water. And then, gently, inevitably, the ritual drew to its close. There was no triumphant moment, no sudden shift in the atmosphere. It simply ended as quietly as it had begun, with a shared breath, a soft exhale, a mutual recognition that they had fulfilled what history demanded of them. The Duchess leaned back slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Beyond the glass, she could see the faintest hint of pale blue beginning to touch the horizon, the earliest whisper of morning. She felt something inside her ease, a tension uncoiling after hours of stillness. The groom sat beside her, shoulders softening, his posture releasing into a tired but steady calm. A soft knock came at the door. The servant's familiar voice whispered politely from the threshold, announcing that the final confirmation was ready to be acknowledged. The witnesses assembled, their footsteps quiet but purposeful as they formed the last procession of the night. When they entered, the chamber felt different, warmer, fuller, touched by the early breath of dawn. They observed the symbolic evidence with the same formality as before, but this time there was an unmistakable shift in the air, a kind of completion, a settling of something that had been stretched taut for hours. The eldest witness bowed slowest. He understood more than any of them that this moment, not the ceremony, not the feasts, not the celebrations to come, was the true heart of the alliance. This was the moment historians would describe in carefully worded letters. This was the moment ambassadors would quietly reference in negotiations. This was the moment that would bind two houses, two territories, and potentially shape the balance of Italy for decades. And with that final bow, the witnesses withdrew once more. But this time, they did not return to their waiting positions. They dispersed slowly, their duty complete, their faces carrying the fatigued satisfaction of men who had fulfilled the strange, solemn task entrusted to them. Back inside the chamber, the door closed gently, leaving the couple alone in the soft, fading glow of candlelight. The Duchess inhaled deeply, her breath steady, her hands resting lightly on her lap. The groom leaned his head back, eyes closed for a moment, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. The final ritual was complete. The night, this long, quiet, intense night, had come to its end, and soon, the dawn would rise over a changed Italy. The first breath of dawn slipped gently across the horizon, pale and delicate, like a thin wash of watercolor brushed lightly over the edge of the sky. It moved slowly at first, a faint glow that barely touched the rooftops of the city below. But even that soft shimmer was enough to change the silence inside the palace. Night loosened its grip. The deep shadows began to soften, their edges fading as the earliest light crept into the long corridors. The candles along the walls flickered uncertainly, as if unsure whether to keep burning or surrender to the coming day. Some had already burned down completely, leaving only thin curls of smoke drifting toward the ceiling. Others still glowed faintly, their flames tired but persistent. In the chamber where the Duchess and groom rested, the heaviness of the night still lingered like a slow-moving mist. They hadn't spoken much since the final ritual. There was nothing to say in it yet. Words would come later, but for now, silence held them gently, like a soft blanket laid over their exhaustion. The Duchess sat near the window, drawn to the quiet unfolding of dawn. Her gown, loosened and softened by the long hours of the night, draped around her in gentle folds. The cool morning breeze touched her cheek, carrying with it the faint scent of river water and early bakeries beginning their day in the distant streets. For a moment, she felt almost outside herself, floating weightless, as if watching her own life from afar. She had done what was required. The rituals were complete. Her status as Duchess now, truly joined to her husband, now fully bound to the political future of Italy, was secured. And yet, she felt none of the victory that the court would later celebrate. No triumph, no pride, only a soft, quiet ache deep inside her ribs, the ache of a girl who had stepped fully into a world she never chose. Behind her, the groom stirred slightly, turning his head toward the pale light. He blinked against the brightness, his features relaxed in a tired, almost peaceful expression. The pressure that had tightened around him since yesterday morning had eased. His shoulders felt lighter now, though still not entirely free. A future of leadership awaited him, a future shaped, at least in part, by what they had sealed in the night. When he rose, he moved slowly, like someone wary of disturbing the fragile stillness that filled the chamber. He joined the Duchess at the window, standing a respectful distance away. For a long moment, they simply watched the city together, in silence. Below them, the streets were waking at their own pace. Merchants opened shutters, workers carried baskets of bread. A few early risers crossed the stone bridge, their figures small against the wide glow of the river. Life was resuming, completely unaware of the monumental night that had just unfolded inside the palace. The groom spoke first, his voice gentle and hushed, as though afraid of breaking something delicate. "It's done," he said, not proudly, not solemnly, just quietly, as someone acknowledging a truth too large for any single breath. The Duchess nodded, her gaze still on the horizon. "Yes," she whispered, her tone soft as morning mist. "It's done." But even as she said the words, she felt the faint stirrings of something else inside her. Not regret, not fear, something more subtle. A sense of crossing a threshold, of stepping from one life into another, so profoundly different that she could no longer see the edges of who she had been the day before. Before they could speak again, soft footsteps approached from the corridor. A gentle knock sounded at the doorpolite, measured, the knock of someone who understood the weight of the night and the delicacy of the morning after. The groom opened the door. One of the chamber servants bowed deeply. His voice, when he spoke, was low and calming. "My lord, my lady, the witnesses have delivered their confirmations to the council. The reports are being prepared. The court awaits your presence whenever you are ready." There was no urgency in his words. Everyone understood that the couple needed time. But the palace, the machinery of politics, had already begun to turn. Documents needed signatures. Messengers needed dispatching. Rival courts needed to be informed. Alliances needed to be announced with careful, diplomatic poetry. The Duchess rose slowly, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion. Her ladies-in-waiting entered quietly, carrying fresh garments of light, silk and embroidered velvet. They moved around her with gentle hands, adjusting her gown, brushing her hair, fastening delicate jewelry chosen to reflect the significance of the occasion. Their eyes were soft, filled with respect, and something like sympathy. The groom dressed as well, his attendants helping him into a doublet of deep wine-red fabric trimmed with gold. He looked composed, not like a conqueror or a triumphant prince, but like a young man carrying a solemn responsibility with as much dignity as he could manage. When they were ready, they stepped into the corridor together. The palace felt different now, no longer cloaked in the tense quiet of the night, but alive with the soft murmurs of ministers and advisers moving discreetly through the halls. The witnesses bowed as the couple passed, acknowledging them with a reverence that hadn't been present the day before. Everyone knew what had occurred. Not the details, not the human truth of the night, but the significance. And in the world of politics, significance was all that mattered. The Duchess and groom entered the council hall, a vast room filled with morning light pouring through tall stained-glass windows. Ministers rose from their seats. Scribes dipped quills into ink. Ambassadors from allied states stood poised to deliver their formal congratulations. A document lay on the central table, thick parchment bearing the seals of the witnesses. The groom placed his hand upon it first. The Duchess followed, her fingers resting lightly against the cool surface. The union was now official, irrefutable, binding, and the future of Italy had shifted. The hall filled with soft murmurs of approval. The bells outside began to ring slow, majestic, echoing through the city with the sound of a new chapter beginning. But inside the Duchess's heart, the morning rang differently, not with celebration, not yet, but with a quiet recognition that her life had changed in a way that could never be undone. And that history, though shaped by her, rarely cared for the person within the story. The bells continued their slow rolling across the city, their tones deep and resonant, as though they were not simply announcing a marriage, but calling forth a new shape of destiny. Their echoes drifted over rooftops and courtyards, spilling into narrow alleyways where merchants set out their baskets of figs and olives, where bakers pulled warm loaves from stone ovens, where young boys chased one another with sticks, pretending they were swords. No one knew the intimate details of the union sealed inside the palace, nor would they ever, but they understood the meaning. A duchess joined to a powerful house, a political bond solidified, a shift in the winds that shaped the Italian states, subtle yet unmistakable. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere remained softer, quieter, suspended between ceremony and exhaustion. The groom walked with a sort of steady, deliberate calm, trying to anchor himself in the present moment instead of letting the magnitude of expectations weigh too heavily on his shoulders. The Duchess moved beside him, and though she held her head high, the faint melancholy in her eyes remained. Not sorrow, something gentler, a sense of being carried forward by forces larger than herself. As they stepped out of the council hall, the murmurs of the ministers trailed after them like a tide. A few bowed deeply, offering hushed blessings. Others exchanged glances heavy with the political implications. Already, whispered strategies began forming between advisors, ambassadors, and military envoys as they calculated how this union could be used, strengthened, or challenged. It was like watching chess pieces shift on a board so vast that no single mind could hold the full pattern. The Duchess felt it all around her, a pressure not physical but atmospheric, like the weight that comes before a summer storm. She wondered briefly, quietly, how many other women before her had walked these same halls after such nights, stepping into futures crafted by others, their personal desires insignificant compared to the demands of statecraft, perhaps countless, perhaps none quite like her. The thought drifted away almost as quickly as it came, dissolving into the soft, echoing footsteps along the marble hallway. They were escorted toward a smaller chamber reserved not for politics or ceremonies, but for a private audience with the closest advisors, the ones who would brief them on the reactions from rival courts. The door opened with a gentle groan, revealing a warmly lit room filled with the scent of burning cedar and faint traces of ink. A round table occupied the center, scattered with letters stamped with wax seals, some already broken open by anxious hands eager to read their contents. An old minister, distinguished by his silver beard and weary but intelligent eyes, bowed respectfully as they entered. His voice, low and soothing, carried the cadence of someone accustomed to measured counsel. "My lord, my lady," he began, "messages have begun arriving even before dawn. Word of your union traveled swiftly faster, perhaps, than we expected." The groom exchanged a glance with the Duchess, the faintest flicker of concern crossing both their features. "How?" the groom asked quietly. "There are those," the minister replied with a subtle, knowing smile, "who make it their profession to carry news before it has fully ripened. But do not worry, the tone across the courts has been largely favorable." He gestured toward the stack of letters. The groom reached for one, its seal marked with a crest of two intertwined lions, a northern ally known for its cautious diplomacy. As he broke the wax and unfolded the parchment, the Duchess leaned gently toward him, reading alongside in silence. The letter contained formal congratulations, predictable praise, and subtle hints of future negotiation. Nothing unexpected. The minister continued, moving toward another letter whose seal bore a sunburst emblem. "This," he said, "comes from the Western Court. They wish to reaffirm their alliance and request a meeting in the coming months to discuss mutual interests." The groom nodded without looking up. "And our rivals?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Quiet," the minister replied. "Too quiet, which means they are thinking, planning, waiting." The Duchess felt a small shiver as though the air around her cooled for a brief moment. She had grown up around politics, but never at its center. Now she stood not near the fire, but in the flames themselves. The minister turned toward her with unusual gentleness. "My lady," he said softly, "your presence in this union carries great weight. Your lineage, your education, your influence among the Western courts, these will shape the tides in ways neither your husband nor the council could achieve alone." She nodded politely, though the words pressed against her like an invisible hand. Influence, presence, weight, these were abstractions to her, meanings assigned by others. Her true self, her quiet thoughts, her private dreams remained untouched by these projections, hidden deep within. The minister continued his briefing, detailing the early reactions from neighboring duchies, kingdoms, and republics. Some expressed cautious support, others thinly veiled envy. Still others attempted to mask their concerns behind elegant diplomatic language. But beneath all the polished lines, the truth was unmistakable. Italy was shifting, and every state wanted a foothold in the new balance of power. As the groom listened, his expression grew more focused, though not hardened. He had been raised for this life, for these responsibilities, trained in diplomacy, leadership, and strategy since childhood. And yet, he was still young, still learning the unpredictable ways of politics. But there was resolve in him, the quiet kind that did not flare like fire, but burned steadily like embers deep within a hearth. The Duchess found herself watching him with new eyes, not as the man who had shared the night with her, not as the partner she had been joined to, but as the emerging leader he was becoming, one tethered to her fate, one whose path she would walk alongside, whether willingly or reluctantly. When the meeting ended, the minister bowed once more. "There will be more messages by midday," he said. "The world is watching, but you need not respond immediately. Take the morning to yourselves." They left the chamber, stepping back into the quieter hallway. The palace felt different, no, not the heavy stillness of dawn, but the gentle hum of life beginning to stir. Servants walked briskly with trays of fruit and goblets of water. Courtiers whispered to one another as they prepared for the coming celebrations. Musicians tuned their instruments in distant rooms, the soft notes floating faintly through the air, like feathers drifting down from a high ledge. The Duchess paused near a large arched window, drawn once again to the sight of the city below. The sun had risen fully now, casting warm golden light across the rooftops and shimmering on the river's slow-moving surface. The city looked peaceful, serene, unaware of the political currents swirling around it. Children played in the square. Women carried baskets of herbs. Fishermen pulled their boats along the shallow edge of the river. The groom joined her, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a space, a shared pause, a moment of breath. Finally, the groom spoke in a soft voice, barely above a whisper. "How are you feeling?" The Duchess took her time before answering. "Like everything around me is changing," she murmured, "and I am trying to understand what that means." He nodded, understanding more than she expected. "I feel the same," he admitted quietly. "I thought I knew what today would be like, what I would be. But I don't think anyone can truly prepare for a day that changes the course of a nation." She turned her head slightly, studying him. His features were calm, composed, but the faint exhaustion beneath his eyes revealed the truth. He was carrying more weight than he let on. "I don't want you to feel alone in it," she said softly. He exhaled, a quiet breath of relief. "I don't," he replied, "because you're here." The simplicity of his words struck her gently, like the soft chord of a harp played in a quiet room. Not passionate, not overly romantic, just honest. And that honesty settled inside her with an unexpected warmth. They continued walking, moving toward the private garden reserved for the ducal family. The doors opened into a peaceful courtyard filled with lavender bushes, small cypress trees, and a stone fountain whose water fell in a slow, rhythmic cascade. The air smelled of earth and fresh blossoms, a welcome change from the polished, perfumed halls inside. They stepped into the garden, the morning sun warming their faces. Birds flitted between branches, chirping softly. A few butterflies drifted lazily through the air, their wings catching the light like tiny shards of stained glass. The Duchess reached out to touch a lavender sprig, rubbing the delicate purple petals between her fingertips. The scent rose, instantly calming, familiar, grounding. "My mother used to keep lavender in her rooms," she said, her voice distant with memory. "When I was little, I would hide beneath her chair and breathe in the scent. It made the world feel softer, safer." The groom listened quietly, respecting the vulnerability in her tone. "My father kept rosemary in our home," he said after a moment. "He believed its scent sharpened the mind. I didn't care much for the reason, but I liked the smell." They smiled faintly, a hint of shared humanity emerging between them. For a moment, the politics, the expectations, the witnesses, the weight of the night, all of it, faded into the background. They walked slowly along the stone path, their steps synchronizing without effort. The garden was sheltered from the noise of the palace, a world within a world, where time seemed to stretch gently rather than push forward. As they walked, they spoke quietly about small things, memories from childhood, the foods they liked, the books they grew up reading, the little fears they never voiced aloud. These were conversations no council would record, no historian would document, yet they shaped something far more important, a connection that could weather the storms ahead. Because storms were coming, they both sensed it. The rivals who stayed silent, the courts that watched too closely, the alliances that shifted with the wind. Italy was a mosaic of tension, beauty, ambition, and fragile agreements. Their marriage had influenced that mosaic in ways neither of them could fully see yet. When they returned to the palace, the courtyard behind them, the minister approached once more, his expression grave yet controlled. "My lord, my lady," he said, "a messenger has arrived. Urgent news from the northern province." The groom straightened slightly, instinctively moving into the posture of command. "What news?" The minister hesitated just long enough to let the tension settle. "The rival duchy," he said, "has begun mobilizing troops near our border." The words hung in the air like a sudden shadow passing over the sun. The duchess felt her breath still. The groom's jaw tightened, and the morning once soft, once peaceful shifted, not into chaos, not yet, but into the tremor of things to come. The words mobilizing troops near our border seemed to echo through the courtyard long after the minister had spoken them, as if they were still searching for a place to settle. The air felt suddenly heavier, like a cloth being draped over the sun. The duchess felt a faint tremor inside her ribs, not of fear alone but of recognition, because she knew this was how political storms began, with a whisper, with a messenger breathless from riding at dawn, with a sentence carried across marble floors. The groom's expression shifted only slightly, yet the change was unmistakable. His eyes, moments ago, softened by the quiet intimacy of the garden, sharpened with the steady focus of a man called too early into the battlefield of decisions. He did not raise his voice nor step back in shock. Instead, he inhaled slowly, grounding himself the way he had been taught since boyhood to absorb, not to react, to think, not to panic. "Who confirmed this?" he asked, his tone even, but laced with a low tension. The minister bowed his head. "Our scouts stationed in the northern watchtowers. They report increased activity, troop movements, supply wagons, smoke from campfires where there should be none." The duchess felt her heartbeat slow into a measured rhythm, like the tolling of distant bells. She had heard stories of how conflicts began never with a dramatic declaration, but with movements in the night, with horses saddled quietly, with commanders gathering men under the guise of training exercises. But this felt too deliberate, too close to the morning of their union to be coincidence. The groom exchanged a glance with her, and something passed silently between them, a shared understanding that the fragile calm of the morning garden had been taken from their hands, replaced by the heaviness of duty. "Send word to the council," the groom said. "We need a full briefing," and summoned General Fiore. The minister bowed again before hurrying away, his steps echoing sharply down the hall. The duchess stood still for a moment, the sunlight warming her shoulders, even as her thoughts grew cold. She felt the groom's gaze on her and turned slowly to face him. "This is because of the marriage," she said softly, not as a question, but as an observation spoken aloud to make sense of the shift. He hesitated, just for a second. "It may be," he admitted, "or they may have been planning it already. But our union, it certainly has changed the balance. Some may feel threatened." She looked past him, toward the distant northern mountains visible through the arched doorway. They stood quiet and unmoving, their jagged peaks giving no sign of the tension building beneath their shadows. Yet somewhere beyond them, men were gathering, weapons being sharpened, horses saddled, lives preparing to change. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely a breath. He blinked, as though startled by the question. "Regret what?" "This union, the weight of it, the consequences." He stepped closer, his voice gentle, despite the edge of urgency in the air. "No, I regret only that the world demands so much of us so quickly, but not the union itself." The duchess looked down, her fingers brushing lightly against her gown. She didn't know whether the warmth rising in her chest was reassurance or sorrow. Maybe both. They walked together back inside, moving through corridors now alive with hurried footsteps, whispered conversations, and the rustling of documents being carried from one chamber to another. The palace's heartbeat had changed. Its rhythm now pulsed with tension, anticipation, and the early tremors of something larger. By the time they reached the council hall, several ministers had already gathered, their faces thoughtful, some alarmed, others composed with forced calm. Maps were spread out across the long wooden table, ink still drying on newly drawn borders, and troop markings. General Fiore, a broad-shouldered man with streaks of grey in his hair and the seasoned calm of someone who had stood on battlefields more than once, approached the groom with a firm bow. "My lord, I've reviewed the initial reports," and the groom asked. The general pointed at the northern border on the map, his thick finger tracing a narrow valley surrounded by dense forests. "They're gathering here, near the pass of Montecervino. It's a strategic choke point. If they block it, they could control trade routes or send troops south." The duchess leaned in, studying the map. The valley looked small on parchment, almost insignificant, mere crease in the landscape. But she knew that wars often hinged on places exactly like this, where terrain funneled armies, where geography shaped the decisions of men. How many? The groom asked quietly. Not enough for an invasion, Fiore said. Not yet, but enough to send a message. The groom exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing with thought. A message timed for today. The general nodded grimly. Exactly. The ministers launched into discussions, some advocating for a show of force, others urging caution. Voices rose and fell around the groom, every sentence laced with urgency. Yet the Duchess remained near him, listening, her presence steady and grounding. Though she had no formal voice in the council yet, her influence was felt, her quiet observance, her thoughtful gaze, her ability to sense the undercurrents beneath the arguments. At last, the groom raised his hand, and the room fell silent. We will not respond with aggression, he said calmly. Not yet. Mobilizing our own troops will only escalate the situation. We need more information, intent, numbers, leadership, and we need to know if this is posturing or preparation. One minister, older and often cautious, nodded approvingly. Another frowned. With the council deep in strategy, the Duchess slipped away for a moment, stepping out onto a balcony overlooking the inner courtyard. She needed air. She needed a moment alone with the reality unfolding around her. The courtyard below bustled with activity, messengers riding in and out, servants preparing for the evening feast that must still take place despite the tension, guards shifting positions with sharpened focus. Yet even in the midst of movement, she felt a strange stillness settle within her. The union had been more than ceremony, more than tradition. It had already altered the balance of power, and she, who once thought herself merely a daughter traded between courts, had become a fulcrum around which kingdoms turned. A soft voice broke her thoughts. "My lady." She turned to see her lady-in-waiting, Alara, standing near the doorway. A gentle, thoughtful woman. Alara had served her since childhood, and understood her heart better than most. "Are you well?" Alara asked softly. The Duchess nodded, though her expression remained distant. "Just thinking." Alara stepped closer. "About the border, about everything," the Duchess admitted. "The night, the morning, the messages, the politics waiting behind every breath." She paused, then added quietly, "I always knew I would be part of something larger, but I didn't know it would begin this quickly." Alara's eyes softened with empathy. "You carry it with grace, my lady." The Duchess gave a faint, tired smile. "I only carry it because I must." They stood in silence for a moment, the breeze lifting strands of the Duchess's hair, the sun warming her hands. She realized suddenly that she wasn't afraid, not exactly. She felt something else beneath the tension. Determination, perhaps, or a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. When she returned to the council hall, the atmosphere had shifted yet again. A new messenger had arrived, sweat shimmering on his brow, dust clinging to his clothes. He bowed deeply, gasping slightly for breath. "My lord, there is more." The room stiffened. "Speak," the groom said. The messenger swallowed hard. "The rival duchy has sent envoys to the eastern states. They seek new allies." The groom's jaw tightened. The Duchess's heart sank, but she stood tall. And the council erupted again, voices rising like a storm breaking against stone. Through it all, the Duchess watched, not as an ornament, not as a silent observer, but as someone beginning to understand that history was shifting beneath her feet, that her role, though unchosen, was unfolding with every passing hour. The council erupted again, voices rising like a storm breaking against stone. Through it all, the Duchess watched not as an ornament, not as a silent observer, but as someone beginning to understand that history was shifting beneath her feet, that her role, though unchosen, was unfolding with every passing hour. And somewhere beyond the northern mountains, the rival duchy waited, watching as Italy's future trembled delicately between peace and the first whispers of war. The noise inside the council hall swelled until it felt almost physical. Ministers leaned over maps, fingers stabbing at inked borders, their robes brushing against parchment in hurried frustration. Some argued for preparation, others for diplomacy, still others for sending a message of strength without direct confrontation. Each voice carried its own weight, its own fear masked beneath layers of measured reasoning. The groom listened, his face calm but tight with concentration. Every word pressed against him like the slow tightening of armor straps. each one bringing him closer to the role he had been destined to fill. A leader, a stabilizing force, a decision-maker when decisions carried the cost of lives. At last, the groom raised his hand again. "Enough," he said, quietly, but with an authority that stilled the room like a sudden drop in wind. Silence settled, rippling outward, until even the faint rustling of robes fell away. "We do not move until we understand," he continued. "Fear is the enemy of reason, and they want us to react out of fear." General Fiore nodded approvingly. "A premature mobilization could make us appear desperate or worse, unstable." One minister, his beard trembling as he exhaled sharply, countered, "But to appear passive invites aggression." The groom looked toward the Duchess. It was not a political glance. It was a human one, seeking quiet reassurance in the middle of the storm. And something inside her steadied, like a flame bending but refusing to go out. "Send a diplomatic envoy," the groom said. "Someone neutral, someone respected. We need to know whether this movement is preparation or provocation." The words carried a careful balance, firmness without aggression, readiness without surrender. The ministers murmured among themselves, their reactions mixed, but none openly opposed him. The Duchess stepped forward before she could question herself. "My lord," she said softly, her voice carrying through the quiet hall like the breeze that slips through a half-opened window. "May I offer a thought?" The ministers turned to her, some with curiosity, some with subtle surprise. She had spoken in council for the first time. The groom met her gaze. "Please," he said gently. She moved closer to the map on the table, her fingers hovering just above the drawn mountain ridge. "If the rival duchy seeks alliances in the east, their motive is not immediate war. No state prepares for battle by simultaneously reaching outward for friends, unless they are uncertain of their strength." Her voice remained calm, steady, which means they fear what this union represents. Fear that Italy might unify without them. Fear often looks like aggression before it becomes it. A soft murmur moved through the room. She lifted her chin slightly. "So we must not show fear in return, but also not pride. Pride closes doors. Fear opens them too quickly." Her eyes moved across the ministers, landing finally on the groom. "We must show clarity." The groom's expression softened with something like admiration. "Well said," he murmured. The minister of state, an older man known for cautious wisdom, bowed his head to her. "My lady speaks with insight." And just like that, her role shifted. Not a silent duchess, not a ceremonial bride, but a political mind in her own right. A place at the table, quiet, but unmistakably earned. General Fiore cleared his throat. "We will send an envoy then. Someone with a reputation for neutrality. Someone who would be welcomed rather than turned away." "What about Ambassador Leto?" one minister suggested. "He's respected on both sides." The groom nodded. "Yes, summon him, and prepare a letter expressing concern, not accusation." A collective breath left the council. The decision was made. But decisions were not endings. They were beginnings. And the Duchess felt it, the subtle tremble of a path forming beneath her feet. As the council dispersed, scribes rushing to prepare messages, advisers huddling in low whispers, the groom approached her. His expression was softer now, touched by gratitude. "You steadied the room," he said quietly. "And me." She lowered her gaze. "I only spoke what seemed true." He shook his head gently. "No, you spoke what was needed." For a moment, they simply stood there, the world around them buzzing with urgency, while a strange stillness held between them. Not romantic, not dramatic, just human. The beginning of an understanding deeper than the forced bonds of politics. The groom reached out and lightly brushed the back of her hand with his fingers, a barely there gesture, like the softest touch of wind. "Thank you," he whispered. She felt warmth bloom in her chest, slow and subtle, like the spreading glow of dawn. They walked together from the council hall, the heavy doors closing behind them with a deep, echoing thud. The corridors were less frantic now, though still humming with activity. Servants carried sealed letters. Guards moved in precise formations. Courtiers whispered about the envoy, the border, the troop movements. The Duchess heard snatches of conversation as they passed, fragments of worry, speculation, hope. Yet in the middle of those murmurs, she noticed something else. Respect. People bowed to her differently now. Not as a decorative presence, but as someone who had begun to shape the air of the court. The groom accompanied her to her private chambers. As they reached the doorway, he hesitated. "Tonight," he said gently, "there will still be the formal celebration. The court expects it. The people expect it. She nodded slowly. "Of course, but," he added quietly, "if at any point you feel overwhelmed or need to step away, I will be there." It wasn't a promise of protection or leadership or dominance. It was a promise of presence. She met his gaze, and for the first time there was a hint of something like warmth between them, not born of obligation, but of recognition. "I'll remember that," she said softly. He bowed his head slightly and departed, leaving her alone with the echoes of the day. Inside her chambers, the sunlight spilled across the floor in mellow golden ribbons. She sank onto the soft cushioned bench near the window, staring out at the distant hills where the mountains rose like ancient guardians. She imagined the soldiers gathering beyond them, men she would never meet, lives that would change if decisions turned toward war. She felt the weight of it, not crushing, but real, heavy with consequence. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Elara stepped in carrying a tray of warm tea scented with mint and chamomile. She set it peacefully beside the Duchess and sat at her usual place. "You spoke in council today," Elara said gently. "I did. You were wise." "I hope so." Elara took her hand. "You were becoming what you were meant to be." The Duchess looked at her, a small, tired, but genuine smile tugging at her lips. "What am I meant to be?" Elara squeezed her fingers lightly. "A steadying force in a world that often forgets to breathe." The words settled inside her like seeds waiting to bloom. Outside, the sun began to sink slowly, its golden light giving way to soft pink and pale lavender hues. The day that had begun with quiet dawn and shifted into tension now drifted toward evening. The envoy would soon be prepared. The preparations for the celebration would continue. The rival duchy would watch, and Italy, suspended on the fragile thread between peace and conflict, would hold its breath. The Duchess closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of the tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands. Tomorrow, the envoy would ride. Tonight, the court would celebrate. Her fingers remained on the cool stone of the window frame as the dim lantern below flickered, stretching long trembling shapes across the courtyard stones. For a moment she simply breathed, steady and quiet, letting the stillness gather around her the way a soft cloak gathers around shoulders in winter. The night outside felt vast, deeper than before, as if it too were holding its breath with her. The muffled murmur of distant guards drifted upward, barely more than a vibration against the walls. She closed her eyes, feeling the rhythm of the castle settling into its late-night silence. The air brushing her face was gentler now, almost timid, carrying the faintest scent of damp stone mixed with lingering rosemary from the gardens. She opened her eyes slowly, allowing them to adjust to the quiet shimmer of moonlight scattered across the courtyard. At first, she did not move. She watched the lantern sway again, its flames stretching thin, then blooming softly as though fighting drowsiness. She wondered for a brief moment how many nights this same lantern had burned, and how many stories the courtyard beneath it had silently witnessed long before her arrival. With a slow inhale, she stepped back from the window, letting her hand drift away from the stone surface. The coolness lingered on her fingertips like a distant memory, and she found herself turning toward the room behind her. It still felt far too large, far too expectant, like a place holding its breath. Soft pooled shadows wrapped themselves around the carved furniture, and the embroidered drapery lay still, except for the faintest quiver where the breeze brushed it. The candles near the bed had burned lower, their flames wobbling with exhaustion. She walked toward the table where a small silver pitcher stood untouched. The surface of the water inside reflected a slender beam of moonlight that slipped in through the window. She poured a small amount into the goblet beside it and took a slow sip, the coolness gliding across her tongue before settling in her chest. It steadied her a little, anchoring her in a night that still felt too heavy with unspoken expectations. She set the cup down carefully, the tiny click sounding too sharp in the quiet room. To soften the moment, she let her fingertips rest on the table edge, tracing the carved patterns along the wood. Someone, decades ago, had carved vines and leaves into the surface, each line deliberate, patient, carrying the quiet labor of hands long gone. She brushed along the grooves, imagining the carver leaning close, steadying the blade, committing tiny pieces of his life into this furniture. It felt strange to think that her own life had been carved, shaped, and placed within these walls with equal deliberateness. Her breath moved slowly in her chest, each exhale quieter than the last. She turned again toward the bed, noticing how the moonlight fell across the embroidered coverlet in a pale ribbon. She approached it not because she felt sleepy, but because the quiet fabric looked like an island in the middle of the room, a place where she could rest, think, or simply drift. She sat gently on the edge, the mattress dipping slightly beneath her weight. The sigh that left her lips was almost imperceptible. She leaned forward, folding her hands together loosely, staring at her fingers as if they belonged to someone else. The soft glow of moonlight caught the faint shimmer of her ring, and she stared at it for a long moment. The gold felt heavier than it should, weighted with meaning she had not chosen but had agreed to bear. She twisted it gently, letting it catch the light. The delicate engraving around the band almost looked like vines echoes of the carved table, patterns repeating through her life whether she wanted them or not. A soft knock at the door, barely to taps made her lift her gaze, not startled, just quietly attentive. She waited, and when no one entered, she rose slowly and crossed the room, her slippers whispering across the floor. When she drew the door open, she found one of the older attendants standing there with her head bowed slightly, the lantern in her hand, forming a modest halo around her. "Forgive me," the attendant murmured softly, her voice respectful and gentle, "but the hour grows late. If you need anything at all, I am just outside." The Duchess offered a faint nod. "Thank you. I'm fine for now." The woman bowed again, then stepped back into the shadowed corridor. The Duchess closed the door quietly, the latch sliding into place with a sound softer than a whisper. She stood there for a moment, hand resting on the door, absorbing the quiet reminder that even now, especially now, she was being watched over not out of affection, but out of duty. She walked back toward the center of the room, letting her fingers trail across the fabric of a chair as she passed. The night felt like it had stretched itself thin, elongating the seconds into something slower, dreamlike. She let her body sink into the chair, drawing her knees slightly inward, resting her hands lightly in her lap. Her eyelids drooped halfway, not from fatigue, but from a slow-moving calm that began spreading through her limbs like warm water. Her thoughts drifted, floating quietly without urgency. She remembered small details from earlier days, the rustle of dresses being arranged, the sound of footsteps on the marble floors, the faint scent of lavender pressed into her traveling clothes. Each memory rose gently, unhurried, drifting through her mind like soft clouds crossing a pale morning sky. None of them carried sharpness, none of them hurt. They simply passed. She let her head rest against the back of the chair and listened. The castle had its own nighttime heartbeats, small, delicate, layered like distant waves. The quiet shift of wooden beams cooling in the night air, the soft scuff of a guard changing position somewhere far below, the flutter of a curtain catching a breeze in a hallway she could not see. These tiny sounds wrapped around her, grounding her in the strange comfort of being held by something ancient and larger than herself. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours stretched thin. She rose slowly again, drifting back toward the bed as though pulled by the quiet gravity of routine. The candles flickered, their flames bending slightly, casting long, trembling shadows that slid across the floor like silent dancers. She extinguished one candle with a gentle breath, watching the smoke coil upward, a small pale ribbon dissolving into air. The bed welcomed her with the subtle warmth of fabric that had been touched by candle glow and the whisper of her presence earlier. She lay down, not fully beneath the covers yet, just resting atop them, staring at the canopy above. The embroidered patterns seemed softer now, blurred by the low light, as if the night itself wished to cradle her quietly. Her breathing slowed. The moonlight painted faint, fragile shapes across the canopy, shifting as the lantern in the courtyard moved again. She watched the patterns glide gently over the fabric, calm and unhurried. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach, her fingers rising and falling with each slow breath. The room grew quieter. Even the breeze seemed to hush itself out of respect for the hour. She felt the heaviness of the day finally loosening its grip, melting into the mattress beneath her. The tension in her shoulders dissolved a little more with each passing moment. She let her eyes drift closed, then open again, not quite ready to surrender fully to sleep, but allowing herself to linger on the edge of it. She rolled gently onto her side, gazing toward the window. From this angle, she could see only a sliver of the courtyard, but it was enough. The lantern's glow moved faintly across the stones, like a small guiding star anchored to the earth. She imagined the quiet world beyond the walls, the hills, stretching into darkness, the faint lines of distant roads, the small villages, asleep in their own stories, all of them tied, in threads visible and invisible, to the night unfolding within these castle walls. Her breath deepened, her shoulders softened. The weight of the ring on her finger no longer felt heavy, it felt distant, like something belonging to another room, another version of her. Perhaps sleep was finally approaching, not forcefully, but gently, like a friend taking her hand. And in that drifting space between consciousness and dreams, she let her thoughts dissolve into the soft hush of the room, allowing the night to carry her forward into whatever quiet hours still remained. The lantern's faint glow continued its slow swaying motion in the courtyard, and she remained curled lightly on her side, hovering in that soft, suspended place where thoughts no longer followed sharp lines. Instead, they blended into one another, like watercolor spreading across damp parchment. She let her eyelids drift lower, half closed, allowing only a narrow ribbon of moonlit world to slip through. Her breathing rose and fell in long, measured waves, deepening as the quiet around her settled even further into its ancient stillness. The faint sound of wind brushing against the outer stone created a low murmur, a deep whisper that circled the room's edges. She listened without intention, without shaping meaning, simply absorbing the gentle hum as it passed by her. Her fingers twitched slightly, curling more fully beneath her as the warmth of the bed seeped slowly into her limbs. The mattress beneath her felt like soft ground, steady and patient, holding her like earth would hold the roots of a tree, natural, unresisting. Yet even in this delicate drifting, her mind began to follow faint threads, subtle and unforced. Shapes formed memories maybe, or thoughts softened into haze. The lantern, the courtyard, the uneasy weight of responsibility, none of it approached her directly. Instead, these ideas hovered at a distance, respecting the muffled quiet she had built around herself. Her breath deepened another degree, the exhale longer, softer, warm against the faint chill of the night air. She tucked her chin slightly toward her pillow, allowing the fabric to brush gently against her cheek. The softness of it felt soothing, almost tender. It reminded her faintly of the touch of linens being smoothed earlier in the day by attendants who had moved with care, wanting everything to appear perfect. Now, in the dim silence, perfection didn't matter, only comfort did. Her eyes drifted closed fully for a moment, but the sway of the lantern's glow drew her back with a gentle tug. She looked again toward the sliver of the courtyard visible from her bed. The light trembled, then steadied, then trembled again. Each small shift felt like a signal sent from some distant thought she hadn't yet reached. She watched, unhurried, letting the subtle dance of light occupy her mind in the quietest way. A faint rustle came from beyond her door, soft, nearly indistinguishable. Perhaps an attendant adjusting their position against the wall, or a guard shifting weight from one foot to the other. Nothing disruptive, nothing alarming. Just a reminder that the castle breathed, even when it slept. The reminder drifted through her with no resistance. She turned her head slightly on the pillow, her hair sliding in a whisper across the fabric. The strands pooled gently behind her, warm where her body had rested, cooler at the ends exposed to the night air. She lifted one hand slowly, brushing a few strands away from her face before letting her arm fall again. The movement effortless, languid. A thought drifted through her, soft, quiet, unshaped. She wondered how many women before her had lain awake in this room, in this very bed, listening to the castle's breath and the flicker of lanterns below. She wondered whether they, too, had felt the strange mix of calm and weight, of destiny and solitude. The idea faded almost as soon as it appeared, leaving behind only the faintest trace of curiosity on her mind. The moon, drifting behind a thin sheet of clouds, dimmed the courtyard just slightly. The lantern's glow became more pronounced, floating in a darker sea. She watched it gently sway, imagining it as a small boat drifting on a quiet river. The thought soothed her, loosening whatever small tension still clung to her ribs. She inhaled, slow and deliberate, letting her chest rise beneath the thin layer of fabric wrapped around her. The warmth of the bed had grown steady now, sinking through her muscles, dissolving any remaining sharpness. Her legs relaxed fully, one stretched out, the other bent slightly at the knee. The angle felt natural, easy. Every breath felt slower, as though time itself had drawn a blanket over her. In the quiet, her mind began to blur the edges of the room. The carved canopy overhead softened into a haze, no longer crisply defined. The embroidered patterns on the drapery shifted into faint, dreamy shapes. Even the moonlight seemed to thicken slightly, like mist forming over still water. She let her eyes close again, this time longer, drifting just beyond waking. Images formed, not clear, not complete, but gentle impressions. A garden path, a stretch of countryside rolling under a pale dawn, a river reflecting the sunlight in trembling fragments. These weren't memories exactly, nor full dreams, just pieces of calm places, stitched lightly together by the softness of her mind. Her breathing deepened further, and she imagined, without seeing it, that the lantern in the courtyard was still swaying in its small, steady rhythm. She found comfort in the thought of something constant outside her window, something that continued even as her mind drifted into quieter depths. Her fingers, resting loosely at her side, curled slightly again, then softened, the muscles releasing almost of their own accord. She shifted her weight ever so slightly to settle more comfortably into the mattress, the fabric beneath her welcoming the subtle adjustment. The castle remained hushed, holding its quiet like a treasured relic. Even the wind seemed to soften, brushing the outer walls with gentler strokes. The room around her dimmed further as the moon slipped behind a thicker cloud. The faint light remaining was enough to shape the edges of furniture and walls, but not enough to define them clearly. Everything blurred into soft silhouettes. She inhaled again, long, slow, steady. Her exhale drifted out in a quiet sigh that barely disturbed the air around her. Sleep edged closer, not with force, but with the slow patience of dusk settling over a valley. Her thoughts wandered again, not chosen, simply appearing. She pictured a candle burning somewhere in a distant corridor, its flame dancing in solitude. Then the image drifted away, replaced by the sound of footsteps on stonelight, measured, echoing faintly. That sound faded too, dissolving into a field of tall grass bending under a summer breeze. The grass melted into a gentle rain tapping against a window. Then nothing, only silence. She turned slightly again, her cheek sinking deeper into the pillow. A warmth gathered along her spine. Her breath warmed the fabric near her lips. Everything around her felt soft, muted, like a distant murmur of a world she no longer needed to tend to for the moment. Still not fully asleep, hovering just at the threshold, she let her mind drift to the slow pulse of the night. She became faintly aware of her heartbeat, steady and calm, echoing quietly beneath the layers of fabric and stillness. It felt almost like footsteps in a long corridor, soft, rhythmic, traveling deeper into quietness. Her mind drifted further, a door opening somewhere far in the castle, a distant whisper, a flicker of torchlight in a hallway she had never walked. None of these were real, they were simply impressions, shaped by the night's hush and her own drifting consciousness. Shadows shifted gently behind her closed eyes, forming faint silhouettes that dissolved before they could take shape. Sleep approached again, closer this time. The edge between thinking and dreaming thinned until it felt like a fine mist brushing against her forehead. She didn't resist. She allowed her breath to guide her, each inhale steady, each exhale a little slower than the last. The lantern's glow flickered again, casting a faint golden pulse across the courtyard. The light reached her room only as a suggestion, a distant shimmer. In her mind, though, it felt like a star drifting along a quiet stream. She watched it through half-formed images, letting it guide her deeper into that soft, drifting calm. Her body relaxed fully now, sinking into the mattress as though becoming part of it. The tension held in her ribs loosened entirely. The weight behind her eyes grew warmer, heavier. A final, slow exhale slipped from her lips, and she let her thoughts settle into still water, not quite asleep, but suspended, held in a night that asked nothing else of her. A night that would drift on gently around her, steady as the lantern swaying in the courtyard below. Her breath moved in slow, even currents now, each inhale soft as drifting silk, each exhale warm against the pillow as she slid deeper into the quiet cradle of sleep. The shift was gentle, barely perceptible, a soft surrender rather than a plunge. The lantern's distant glow, though she no longer saw it, still swayed at the edge of her mind like a mark left on her thoughts before she crossed fully into rest. Everything around her remained hushed, sealed in the vast, steady quiet of night. The room grew farther away from her, not disappearing but dimming, fading into a comfortable blur. The bed, once a physical presence beneath her, became more like a memory of warmth and softness. The weight of fabric on her body loosened into a comforting heaviness that kept her tethered only lightly to the waking world. Her breath found a new rhythm, slower, deeper, the rhythm of someone drifting through the earliest gate of dreams. A faint warmth spread across her limbs, starting from the center of her chest and drifting outward like ripples moving across calm water. She could feel the shapes of the room around her, only vaguely now, like outlines half submerged in fog. The details no longer mattered. Only the quiet did. Her thoughts stretched, then softened, melting into the growing darkness behind her eyes. Sleep reached for her gently, wrapping around her with the same slow patience as a tide reaching the shore. There was no resistance in her, only the weightless drift that comes when the body finally yields to exhaustion, to stillness, to the night's long embrace. Somewhere beyond her door, a guard shifted his stance, the faint clink of metal brushing stone. The sound drifted into her room like a far-off echo, muted by thick walls and the layers of sleep settling over her. It touched her awareness briefly, a featherlight moment, and then dissolved. The castle, filled with ancient chambers and long hallways she had yet to explore, breathed on through darkness. Her breathing deepened again, the rise and fall of her chest slow and steady. Her fingertips, once curled loosely, now lay fully relaxed against the sheets, the last traces of tension slipping away. Even her dreams had not yet taken shape. She rested in that quiet in-between place, hovering softly between consciousness and the deeper valleys of sleep. The faint breeze that slipped through the window brushed her cheek, but she did not stir. It played along the edge of the curtains, sending a small ripple through the fabric, and then continued past her like a drifting whisper, moving toward a place she could no longer sense. The moon, hidden behind a heavier cloud now, dimmed the room further until only the faintest shadows remained. Minutes folded into minutes, stretching and thinning in the darkness. Her breathing continued its slow rhythm, the only living sound in the quiet chamber. The lantern in the courtyard, still swinging gently, cast its light in small arcs that no longer reached her eyes, but its presence lingered in the room all the same. Like a memory the air refused to let go of. As sleep took firmer hold, her mind began to weave the faintest beginnings of dream shapes with no edges, scenes with no clarity, soft colors, blurred outlines, impressions of movement that felt like distant memories. None of it formed into anything solid. Everything remained fluid, shifting like mist, rolling across a valley before dawn. Her body sank deeper into the mattress, her weight settling completely. Her breath warmed the space around her, creating small pockets of gentle heat beneath the sheets. The quietness of the room wrapped around her fully now, sealing her in a cocoon of stillness so deep it felt almost endless. Something shifted in the distance, a door closing softly somewhere along the corridor. The sound reached her as a faint vibration rather than a noise. It passed through her like a ripple across calm water, barely noticeable. Her breathing didn't change, her body didn't stir. The castle could have been moving around her, and yet she lay untouched by all of it. Her dreams moved a little more, stirring like shadows brushing the edges of her consciousness. She felt, for the briefest moment, the sense of walking through a garden at dusk, the scent of flowers she had never seen, gravel underfoot, a soft, warm wind brushing her hair. But the image drifted away before it could solidify, dissolving into gentle darkness. The stillness of the night deepened further. Walls thick, ancient, and steadfast held the quiet like a secret. The ceiling overhead loomed vague and soft. Even the flicker of the almost extinguished candles had faded into tiny smudges of orange light, their flames low and weary. She turned very slightly in her sleep, barely more than a shift of her shoulder and the softest roll of her head. The pillow beneath her welcomed the movement with a feather-like resistance. Her breathing caught once, then released, steady again. Her hair spilled across the sheets in a loose wave, catching what faint light remained in small, barely visible gleams. Her dreams deepened. The garden reappeared, this time more vivid. A stone path winding among tall hedges, a pale sky, neither day nor night, the sound of water trickling from a fountain she couldn't see. Her steps felt light, effortless, like she was moving through air. No voices, no demands, only the quiet serenity of a place that existed solely in the softness of her mind. She moved through this dream garden without intention, simply drifting. Leaves shivered in a wind that didn't disturb her. The sky above slowly shifted from pale grey to muted lavender, though no sun or moon appeared. She reached out a hand to touch a leaf, but before her fingers met it, the dream shifted again. She found herself standing at a balcony overlooking a vast countryside. The rolling fields below stretched endlessly, covered in morning mist. The line where earth met sky blurred into a soft haze. She could almost feel the wind against her face, warm and steady, though she did not move. Her hand rested on a cold stone railing, so cold she felt it even through the layers of sleep. Then the balcony faded too. She drifted into another scene, this one even softer flicker of candlelight against a distant wall, the faint sound of footsteps echoing from some unending hallway. She walked toward the sound, her steps silent, but before she reached its source, the scene dissolved again, melting into softer, hazier forms. Her breath caught once more in her chest, deepened, and then flowed evenly again. The dreams folded and unfolded around her, shifting without urgency, carrying her deeper into sleep's quiet currents. The castle outside remained still. The lantern in the courtyard kept its small vigil. The night grew heavier, the shadows longer, the silence deeper. Her breathing remained steady, relaxed, untroubled, and sleep carried her further into its warm, quiet depths. Cliff sleep held her now in a deeper place, a quieter realm where awareness dissolved completely into drifting impressions. Her breathing remained slow and even, the steady rise and fall of her chest barely disturbing the thick stillness of the room. Outside, the castle continued its ancient vigil, each stone wrapped in darkness as though the night had draped a heavy cloak across its walls. No footsteps echoed now, no voices whispered, only the sound of the faint wind brushing along the outer battlements moved through the world. Her dream continued its quiet shifting, like a long tapestry being unwound thread by thread. The scenes no longer appeared in distinct fragments. Instead, they blended softly into one another, forming a continuous stream of gentle imagery that drifted around her mind without shape or urgency. She floated through it, her consciousness a small ember glowing deep within. The dream garden reappeared vaster this time, its paths stretching further into an endless mist. The sky overhead glowed with a muted silver, neither morning nor evening, holding a steady, serene light that touched every leaf with a soft sheen. She walked without walking, gliding through the space as though moved by the breeze itself. Her fingertips brushed along the tops of tall plants that weren't quite solid, dissolving into faint trails of light when touched. The sound of distant water returned too this time, more melodic, like a stream flowing over smooth stones. Her mind embraced the garden with the ease of someone wandering through a memory that never truly belonged to them. There was no fear here, no tension, no reminder of the duties anchored to her waking life. Only the soft hum of a world shaped entirely by sleep's gentle hand. She drifted deeper still. The garden faded, replaced by a corridor lined with tall windows that glowed with soft moonlight. She glided along the hallway as though carried by the air, her footsteps leaving no sound on the polished floor beneath her. The windows stretched endlessly, a repeating pattern of pale frames holding views of a cloudy night sky. She paused at one, though she did not understand why. Outside, the clouds moved slowly, forming long layered waves drifting across the darkness. She reached out, touching the window pane. Her hand passed through it, not as an act of force, but as though the glass itself had become smoke. Her fingers met the cool night air beyond, and she stepped forward, drifting out into the open space. The ground did not fall away beneath her. Instead, she hovered above the courtyard, weightless, silent, watching the lantern sway below, exactly as it did in the waking world. It glowed faintly, its flame bending in the wind. The faint arc of its movement created soft halos of gold in the dark. Her dream self drifted closer to it, drawn by the warmth of its light. When she reached it, the lantern expanded gently its glow, brightening, widening, wrapping around her in waves of soft heat. It felt like standing near a hearth on a winter morning, the kind of warmth that seeped beneath the skin and into the bones. The lantern's glow brightened further, until it washed out the courtyard entirely. The world dissolved into a field of golden light, shimmering softly like dust, suspended in sunbeams. She drifted through it, unhurried, feeling as though each particle of light carried a faint lullaby. Her breathing, even in sleep, matched that rhythm, slow, steady, like a tide rising and falling on a quiet shore. Gradually the golden glow dimmed, replaced by a gentle darkness. She stood now in a small room that existed nowhere in the castle, nowhere in memory. A room shaped only by the softness of sleep. A single chair sat near the center, carved with patterns she did not know. A single candle burned upon a tiny table, its flame steady and calm. The light filled the space without flickering, as though the air here was too serene for disturbance. She approached the chair and placed her hand upon its carved back. Her fingers traced the patterned spiral's waves. And she felt warmth beneath her touch, like the chair recognized her presence and welcomed it. She lowered herself into it slowly, though she did not feel the weight of her body. The chair held her gently, allowing her to rest as though she had been carrying a great burden for far too long. The candle flame swayed slightly, casting soft shadows across the floor. She watched them stretch and shrink in slow, steady movements. Time passed without measurement. There was no sense of minutes or hours, only a soft progression of calmness that deepened with each breath. The room shifted again. The walls dissolved like sand meeting a wave, and she found herself standing at the edge of a quiet lake. The water was clear and still, reflecting a pale sky with such precision that it was difficult to see where one ended and the other began. The air was cool but gentle, brushing her skin with a softness that reminded her of her first steps outside on spring mornings as a child. She moved toward the water. Each step was soundless. When she reached the edge, she knelt and touched the surface lightly. The ripples spread outward in slow circles, widening and widening until the entire lake shimmered with motion. The reflection blurred, but in a soothing way, like looking through heat-hazed air. She leaned closer and saw her own face reflected back, but not as she had seen herself in the mirror earlier, weighed down by responsibility and expectation. Here, her face appeared softer, calmer, free of the tightness that had lived behind her eyes. Her expression flickered slightly, and then the image dissolved into patterns of light that drifted outward across the surface. She stood, lifting her eyes to the far side of the lake. Tall reeds swayed there, their movement rhythmic and hypnotic. Beyond them, rolling hills stretched into the distance, each layer fading more gently than the last. The air smelled faintly of water and earth, and something sweet, perhaps the scent of night-blooming flowers. She had never seen but felt she recognized in some distant way. She stepped back from the lake, and the dream shifted once more, this time into a vast field under a starlit sky. The stars were brighter than any she had seen from the castle windows, so bright they seemed to pulse gently, breathing with the same slow rhythm she had fallen into. The field was covered in soft grass that brushed her ankles lightly as she moved through it. The entire landscape glowed faintly, as though illuminated from within. She tilted her head upward to look at the stars. They formed patterns she did not know, shapes that seemed familiar in some forgotten way, like symbols from a story heard long ago. One star pulsed more brightly than the others, drawing her attention with its steady radiance. She stared at it, feeling warmth wash over her, a warmth that spread from her chest out toward the tips of her fingers. The star brightened, flickering just once. When her eyes closed, not from force, but from the weight of peace settling over her, the star's light followed her inward, becoming part of the drifting haze that carried her deeper into the softness of sleep. She breathed again, long and slow. The dream field faded. The lake dimmed. The room with the candle dissolved. The lantern's golden glow slipped away, and she rested, sinking now into the quietest depths of sleep, the place where even dreams released their hold and only calm remained. Outside, the castle remained silent, its walls holding the night like a secret. Inside, her breathing was the only movement, steady and gentle. Sleep wrapped her fully, tender and complete. Yet even as the candles trembled in their narrow brackets, and the corridor stretched ahead in that faint golden haze, there was a sense that time itself had begun to soften around the edges, as if the night wished to protect what remained of its silence. And so she walked forward, her fingertips brushing the stones, as though reassuring them that she had not forgotten the weight of the past they had witnessed, nor the stories that breathed quietly inside their cold interiors. The guard who escorted her lingered several steps behind, keeping his presence light, respectful, understanding that this part of the castle belonged to her thoughts more than to any noble decree. The hallway opened gradually into a smaller atrium, one rarely used, its windows narrow and high, and its floor laid with older tiles that bore faint patterns from centuries before. Lucretia paused here, almost automatically, her breath settling into the stillness. She could hear the faint sigh of the wind pressing against the shutters, a soft rhythmic push, the kind of sound that could lull a restless mind if it listened long enough. It reminded her for a moment of summer nights in Ferrara, when the rivers whispered under bridges and she had felt certain, in the naive way youth often feels certain, that life would move gently. But everything had moved differently instead, bending and rearranging itself around alliances, expectations, and the unspoken demands carried by names larger than any one person. She stood there, letting these thoughts drift not painfully, but like slowly falling feathers, because the truth was that she no longer resisted remembering. Memories had their own quiet temperature. She had learned, neither warm nor cold, merely present. And in this castle, where every wall had overheard more secrets than any confession box, remembering seemed an ordinary act. A servant girl approached then, bowing her head with a blend of humility and the nervousness that came from being summoned so close to the ducal chambers. She carried with her a small tray silver, slightly tarnished along the edges with a cup of warm herb mixture meant to steady the nerves before sleep. Lucretia accepted it with a gentle nod, her fingers curling around the cup, grateful for the warmth that seeped into her palms. The scent was calming, a mixture of chamomile, lemon balm, and something faintly bitter that old apothecaries claimed quieted the heart. She sipped slowly, not because she needed it, but because the act of sipping gave her a moment to remain still. The servant withdrew silently, and Lucretia stepped again into motion, continuing down the corridor until she reached the turning that led toward the older wing. Here the stones grew darker, the air cooler, carrying the faint mineral scent of shadowed spaces. Only a few torches burned, spaced widely apart, making the hall appear almost like a chain of dim islands. She continued anyway, unhurried, familiar with the darkness and the comfort it offered. The old wing was where she often walked when she needed quiet, its rooms long unused, its stairwells twisting into small, forgotten corners where dust settled peacefully and no one sought to sweep it away. She moved toward one of the smaller chambers, pushing the wooden door gently so it would not creak too loudly. Inside, the room was scarcely lit by a single candle. The ceiling arched low, the walls still held the faded remains of painted vines, and in the center stood a bench smooth from years of touch. She sat there slowly, placing the empty cup beside her, exhaling in a long, even drift of breath. The quiet here was deeper, not the alert quiet of hallways, but the settled quiet of old rooms that had accepted abandonment without sorrow. Her mind wandered again to the chronicles that would someday describe this night, if they ever dared. They would speak of consummations witnessed, of alliances sealed not by affection but by ritual necessity, of bodies used as political signatures. But none of those chronicles would include these moments afterward: the soft walking through dim halls, the steadying of breath, the private gathering of thoughts. History rarely cared for the gentle intervals that followed the harsh demands of duty. Yet these intervals were where humanity lived. She leaned her head back against the wall, feeling the coolness seep through her hair. Somewhere in the castle, a door closed softly, followed by the muted steps of servants preparing for the last hour before dawn. The night was thinning. She could sense it, that subtle shift when darkness begins to lose its conviction, when even the shadows seem to anticipate the pale intrusion of morning. And with that shift came another recognition. The night had done what was required of it. The witnesses had seen, the vows had been sealed, the lineage secured, and the expectations of Italy's tangled political future quietly nudged into place. But none of it felt immediate or monumental here. Instead, everything felt far away, muffled as though wrapped in wool. She let her eyes close, not to sleep but simply to rest. The air settled softly around her. The candle flickered once, then steadied, its small flame holding on with patient loyalty. She could almost imagine the castle breathing with her, its ancient stones expanding slightly with each inhalation of the night, contracting with each exhalation, as though for a moment they shared the same rhythm. When she opened her eyes again, she let them adjust slowly to the dim glow. Her thoughts drifted onward, not with urgency, not even with intention, but like a small boat gently pushed by a quiet tide. She thought of how little choice any of them had in becoming symbols rather than people, how the world beyond these walls would speak of her as though she were a character in a fable rather than a woman sitting in an old room waiting for dawn. And yet, there was a curious comfort in knowing that despite all of it, she still had moments like this, moments where the world did not demand anything from her except to breathe. The sound of distant footsteps approached then, slow and measured, the kind that announced someone with purpose but not haste. It was the old chamberlain, his posture slightly bent from years of service, but his voice still steady when he reached the doorway and spoke her name softly. She lifted her head, acknowledging him with a small nod. He informed her that the Duke had retired to his chambers, that the castle had settled, and that if she wished, he could escort her back to her room. She rose gently, smoothing the folds of her gown, her breath still quiet. Together they walked through the corridor again, the chamberlain's lantern casting a soft orb of light that floated ahead of them. The stones glowed faintly, and the shadows slipped aside as they passed. Lucretia listened to his footsteps and found them oddly reassuring, like the steady beat of an old clock marking the hours with calm insistence. When they reached her chamber, he bowed slightly, offering a final polite wish for rest, before turning away. She entered the room slowly, closing the door behind her with deliberate quiet. The chamber was warm, its hearth glowing with reddish embers. The bed's canopy swayed slightly, as though stirred by an invisible current. She moved toward the window, parting the curtains just enough to see the outer courtyard below. The sky was still dark, but a faint paling hovered near the horizon, the early whisper of dawn. And for a long moment she simply stood there, her fingertips resting lightly on the cold edge of the window frame, her breath soft as the first suggestion of morning lifted itself slowly behind the hills. The pale glow did not yet form a true line of light, nothing so sharp, but rather a quiet thinning of the night, like ink spreading gently across parchment until it begins to fade at its edges. She watched this faint transformation with an expression that was neither hopeful nor weary, but calmly accepting, as someone who had learned that dawn always arrives, whether invited or not. She let the curtain slip back into place and turned slowly toward the room. Her steps measured on the rug that softened the echo of her movement. The chamber felt warmer now, the hearth still alive with its low, smouldering warmth. A faint scent of lavender drifted from the linens, something the ladies-in-waiting always refreshed before nightfall, believing it brought peaceful sleep. She walked toward the small table where a silver pitcher of water waited, poured herself a sip, and drank slowly, feeling the coolness run through her in a way that grounded her, steadying her breath further. Her gaze moved across the room again, taking in the familiar shapes, the carved chest at the foot of the bed, the tall screen where her gowns hung like slumbering shadows, the small writing desk where faint traces of last week's correspondence still lingered in the air. Everything had its place, and everything appeared unchanged. Yet she felt different now, as though the night had settled into her bones in a way that no one watching her later in the day would ever recognize. Duty had been performed, history had shifted, and yet life continued with its quietly unfolding rhythm. She sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, the embroidered coverlet cool beneath her palms. For a moment she simply sat there, letting the silence cradle her. The castle's sounds had softened, the occasional creak of settling beams, the muffled brush of wind against the shutters, and somewhere in the distance the faint far-off call of a night watchman announcing the hour. His voice reached her like a thread carried through stone corridors, stretched thin by distance, softened by time. She listened more out of habit than curiosity, letting the sound weave itself into her drifting thoughts. A part of her wondered how this night would be remembered, if it would be remembered at all. Would the historians someday speak of her as a name tied to treaties and alliances, or would she vanish into the softer footnotes of political necessities? She suspected the latter, for history often preferred the bold strokes of men's ambitions over the quiet endurance of women. And yet, she felt no bitterness. There was a strange peace in understanding the nature of one's place within a story as vast as Italy's. Some were architects of change, others were the stones against which change pressed its weight. She eased herself onto the bed, stretching out slowly, the mattress accepting her in a gentle embrace. She did not intend to sleep, but simply to lie still, to let her thoughts settle like dust in a quiet room. The canopy above her framed a small square of darkness, its fabric stirring faintly with the movements of the air. She found herself breathing in time with it, one soft rise, one soft fall. Outside, dawn crept a little closer, though its light had yet to reach her chamber. She felt suspended in a moment between night and morning, between what had already happened and what would come. Her eyes drifted closed, not in fatigue, but in a meditative restfulness. She could feel the warmth of the embers against one side of her face, and the cooler air from the window on the other, creating a balance that soothed her. Time slipped quietly around her, stretching, loosening, relaxing its hold. She lay there, suspended in this gentle in-between, until at last the faint sound of footsteps approached her door, soft, cautious, respectful. A delicate knock followed, barely more than a whisper against the wood. She remained still for a moment, letting her breath finish its slow exhale before she answered. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, low, and steady. The door opened slightly, enough for one of her ladies-in-waiting to peek inside with a tentative nervousness that showed she knew it was early, perhaps too early, but necessity demanded her presence. "Forgive me," the young woman whispered, stepping inside with graceful hesitation, "but the Duchess mother asks if you might be prepared soon. The morning council has been arranged earlier than usual." Lucretia listened without complaint, her eyes soft but alert. She pushed herself upright, her feet finding the floor, her posture collected. She nodded with a gentleness that allowed the young woman to exhale in relief. The lady-in-waiting moved quickly to prepare the basin, pouring warm water that released thin curls of steam, the scent of rose petals rising faintly with it. Lucretia washed her hands and face slowly, the warmth soothing and steadying. When she looked into the polished silver mirror, she saw a face calm, composed, with shadows under her eyes, but not of weariness. These were the shadows of a night fully lived, a night that carried weight but not despair. She allowed herself a moment to meet her own gaze, to acknowledge the quiet strength reflected there. Then she turned away gently, allowing the lady-in-waiting to begin arranging her hair. The comb moved through her long strands with soft strokes, each pass releasing a faint whisper of sound. She could feel the girl working carefully, perhaps sensing the fragility of the moment, perhaps afraid to disturb the serenity that had settled in the room. The castle was waking slowly now. Footsteps echoed distantly, and the muted clatter of preparations began to filter through the walls. Morning had arrived, not in a blaze of brightness, but in a slow, steady bloom of pale light, beginning to creep along the edges of her curtains. By the time her hair was braided with understated elegance, the glow of dawn had begun to touch the floor, a faint golden line stretching timidly toward the hearth. She stood then, letting the new day surround her, breathing in its coolness. It felt different now, like stepping into a chapter whose pages had already been written but not yet read. She knew that every conversation, every glance at the council table, every whispered comment between noble families would carry the subtle shift that had been sealed in the night. She walked to the door slowly, her hand resting for a moment on the smooth wooden surface, feeling the grain beneath her fingertips. This door, which had closed behind the heaviness of the night, would now open into the beginning of what came next. History rarely allowed pauses. She knew. It unfurled continuously, and people were drawn along with it, willing or not. But she stepped forward with quiet acceptance. When she opened the door, the corridor outside glowed with the first true touch of morning. The stones gleamed faintly, the air was cooler, and somewhere deeper in the castle a bell began to ring slow, deliberate, marking the start of the day. She exhaled once, softly. Then she walked toward the light. And as she walked toward the light, the corridor seemed to stretch gently before her, not in length but in stillness, as though the castle itself understood that the transition from night to morning required a kind of quiet ceremony. The pale gold of early dawn washed softly across the stones, blurring their harsh edges and giving them a muted glow, almost as if even the walls were reluctant to fully awaken. Her steps fell lightly, their echoes subdued and respectful in this tender hour when the world had not yet gathered its noise. The air carried a faint crispness, the kind that drifts into old buildings during early morning, slipping through cracks and swirling under doors. It brushed against her skin, refreshing but not cold, and it made her more aware of her own breath, slow, deep, steady. She felt strangely centered, as though the night had distilled everything unnecessary and left behind only the quiet essence of what she needed to carry. As she approached the junction where the corridor branched into two directions, she paused momentarily. To the left lay the council chamber, where the morning's discussions would unfold with their predictable mixture of urgency and caution. To the right, a smaller passage led to the private oratory, a place of deep quiet, seldom visited, where aged candles dripped wax like frozen tears, and the air always seemed to hold the scent of solemn contemplation. She felt a gentle pull toward that direction, as though something within her recognized a need to step briefly into solitude before stepping into the realm of politics. She turned right. The hallway leading to the oratory was narrower, its ceiling lower, its stones older. Here the torches had been allowed to burn down during the night, leaving only faint embers in their metal cups. Yet the dimness did not feel oppressive. It felt intimate, protecting the stillness within. Her feet knew the way by instinct, guided less by sight and more by the familiar rhythm of the turns. She reached the small wooden door, its surface polished by the touch of generations, and pushed it open quietly. The room greeted her with its deep silence. It was illuminated only by the pale morning light slipping through a narrow slit window, a single soft beam stretching across the floor like a ribbon of dawn. Dust particles drifted lazily through that beam, catching the light in tiny shimmering motions that resembled drifting stars. She stepped inside, letting the door close gently behind her, and for a moment simply stood there, absorbing the stillness. The oratory held a single wooden bench, worn smooth by the decades, and a simple altar adorned with a faded cloth and a small silver cross that had lost its shine. Yet there was a comforting humility in the simplicity. It reminded her that beneath all the grand halls, fine garments, and political maneuvers, there existed an older truth, the quiet heartbeat of life that required no witnesses and made no demands. She moved toward the bench and sat down slowly, her hands resting on her lap. The light touched her face gently, and she closed her eyes not to pray in any formal sense, but to gather herself. Her breaths deepened. For a long stretch of time she remained in this stillness, listening to nothing and everything at once. The faint rustle of air, the creaking of the old wood beneath her, the distant, barely there hum of a waking world. What had happened the night before seemed both close and distant. She could still feel the weight of those moments, the eyes of the witnesses, the solemn necessity that had guided every gesture. She could still sense the tension of history moving around her, shaping her into something both fragile and essential. Yet in this quiet room, those memories softened, like ink that has dried and settled into paper. They belonged to the past now, and the present had a different texture, lighter, calmer, composed. When she opened her eyes again, the light had grown slightly stronger, tracing her shadow more clearly on the stone floor. She rose slowly, feeling a new steadiness within her, as though the silence had anchored her again. With a final glance at the altar, she turned toward the door and stepped back into the hall. The castle was more awake now. She could sense the shift even before hearing it. Servants' footsteps carried more purpose. The murmurs from distant rooms had grown firmer, and the scent of baking bread drifted faintly from the kitchens below. She followed the corridor back to the main hall and made her way toward the council chamber. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their armor reflecting the brighter dawn light. They bowed respectfully as she approached, stepping aside to allow her passage. She entered quietly, her gaze adjusting to the chamber, a particular blend of shadow and early sun-tall windows admitting slanted beams that lit the long table where advisers had begun to gather. The room hummed with low conversation, subdued but attentive. The men seated around the table wore expressions of polite calculation, each turning slightly as she entered, acknowledging her presence with deferential nods. She felt no intimidation here. She had long since learned that the loudest voices often carried the least substance. In the world of courts, subtlety mattered more, and silence had its own kind of power. She took her place at the side of the table, her posture composed, her hands folded loosely before her. The council members exchanged murmured greetings, offering compliments on her presence, each phrase laden with layered meanings. She replied with calm politeness, letting their words flow around her without disturbing her inner balance. The Duke entered moments later, his expression controlled, his steps deliberate. He carried himself with the kind of dignity expected of a man who had just ensured the continuation of a powerful lineage. Yet there was a subtle heaviness to him too, a quiet fatigue that no one dared mention. He acknowledged her with a small, formal nod before taking his seat at the head of the table. The discussion began. Voices rose and fell, measured and deliberate, weaving intricate patterns around matters of territory, alliances, trade routes, and the delicate state of neighboring courts. She listened with steady attention, offering soft-spoken observations when appropriate. Her words, though few, were sharp with clarity. Several councillors paused to consider her suggestions, adjusting their positions accordingly. It was not lost on anyone that the events of the night before had granted her a new degree of influence, subtle but unmistakable. Yet even as she engaged in these discussions, her mind remained half-rooted in the gentle calm she had carried from the oratory. She heard the voices, understood the implications, observed the shifting tensions, but she did not allow them to disturb the quiet centeredness within her. It was as if she were moving through 2 layers of reality, the world of politics sharp-edged and relentless, and the world of thought, fluid and tranquil. Time passed, though she hardly registered its movement. When the morning's council finally concluded, and the advisers rose from their seats with murmured farewells, She remained for a moment longer. The room emptied gradually, leaving behind the lingering scent of ink, wax, and aged parchment. She stood, smoothing the folds of her gown, and walked toward the window. The sunlight had grown fuller now, brightening the courtyard below, where servants hurried about their tasks, and a few early riders crossed the gates, toward the outer roads. She watched the scene unfold with a serene detachment, feeling neither hurried nor burdened. There was a clarity to the morning, a transparency that allowed her to see the world without distortion. She knew the day would bring expectations, tasks, conversations, glances heavy with meaning. She knew her life would continue to unfold along the path laid out by dynastic ambitions and political necessity. Yet she also knew she carried within her a calm that no counsel could shake, no alliance could fracture, a calm born of the night's deep stillness, the quiet chamber walls, the fading candlelight, the slow walk through dim hallways, the old oratory's silence, and the steady breath she had reclaimed within its walls. With one final quiet breath, she turned away from the window. The day awaited her, and she stepped into it with gentle resolve. And as she stepped into the day with that gentle resolve, the corridor greeted her with a brightness she had not noticed earlier, as if the castle itself had fully awakened during the council session, and now regarded her with a different kind of quiet acknowledgement. The sunlight had reached farther inside, sliding across the stones like a warm, cautious hand. It softened the atmosphere, warming the chill that often lingered in the morning hours within these ancient walls. She walked at a calm, unhurried pace, allowing the pace of her breathing to dictate her movement. Servants passed occasionally, their steps brisk, their eyes respectfully lowered. Some carried baskets of linens, their soft rustling merging with the distant echo of footsteps. Others bore trays of bread, cheese, fruit preparations for the morning meal. They moved with the quiet efficiency of those who understood that the rhythm of the palace depended on the careful alignment of countless little tasks. The corridor eventually opened into a gallery lined with tall windows, each one offering a slightly different view of the gardens below. The sunlight cascaded through them in gentle slants, catching dust motes that drifted lazily like tiny, wandering planets suspended in their own soft orbit. She moved toward one of the windows, drawn by the brightness and the subtle warmth pressing through the glass. Outside, the gardens lay washed in early daylight. Dew clung to the grass in delicate beads, shimmering like silver threads woven across the earth. The flower beds were still half dormant, their blooms not yet fully unfurled, as if waiting for the sun's touch to give them permission to open. A few gardeners moved quietly along the paths, bending occasionally to inspect the soil or tug at a stray weed. Their movements were slow, deliberate, unhurried, mirroring the tranquil rhythm of the morning itself. For a moment, she simply watched. The view calmed her further, the serenity of the scene seeping into her thoughts. Morning in the gardens always felt like a place untouched by the complexities that ruled the interior halls. Here, nature held court, and everything moved according to the quiet laws of sunlight, moisture, and the turn of the season. It soothed her, offering a silent reminder that life could continue with gentle persistence, even when history demanded noise and spectacle. She left the window after a moment and continued down the length of the gallery. Her steps hushed against the polished floor. At the far end, a door led to the small morning room, where she often took her first meal of the day. When she entered, the room was lit with soft, natural light, its carved wooden chairs casting long shadows across the tiled floor. A table had been set for her, with simple elegance bread, still warm from the oven, a small dish of honey, slices of soft cheese, and a pot of lightly perfumed tea, whose steam rose in slender, curling wisps. She sat down quietly, inhaling the gentle aroma of the tea before pouring herself a cup. The warmth seeped into her fingers, grounding her once again in the present moment. She drank slowly, savoring the blend of jasmine and something faintly earthy that reminded her of the countryside. With each sip, the tension that had subtly threaded itself into her shoulders during the council meeting eased a little more. The room held a peaceful stillness. Only the faint crackle of a small fire in the hearth broke the silence, its shifting embers softly rearranging themselves in the quiet. She took a piece of bread, dipped it lightly into the honey, and tasted the sweetness with deliberate slowness. Meals like this were often her refuge. They required no formality, no conversation, no performance. Just the simple act of nourishing the body while letting the mind drift. As she ate, her thoughts wandered again to the events of the night before, not with the heaviness of responsibility, but with a muted curiosity, as if examining a distant landscape through a veil of morning mist. The night had been a turning point, yes, but not in the way a storm announces itself. It had been subtle, inevitable, woven into the fabric of dynastic expectation long before she ever stepped into that castle. Now that it had passed, what remained was a quiet unfolding, a sense that life would proceed, but on a new and delicately altered course. She finished her meal slowly, rising once she felt the warmth of the tea settle comfortably within her. The morning room's door opened with a soft creak as she stepped back into the corridor. This time, instead of returning toward the central hall, she chose a quieter route that wound through a lesser-used part of the castle. These hallways were older, their stones darker, their tapestries faded from centuries of exposure. Yet they carried a comforting sense of history, as though walking through them connected her to the countless footsteps that had passed this way before. She moved down the corridor until she reached a tall, arched window that overlooked the eastern courtyard. This area was quieter than the main grounds, a place where apprentices trained with wooden practiced swords under the guidance of older guards. Today, only 2 young squires stood in the yard, moving through slow drills under the calm supervision of a veteran soldier whose voice carried gentle instructions rather than stern commands. Their movements were practiced, repetitive, almost meditative. She watched for a moment, appreciating the quiet discipline of their motions. It struck her how many lives ran parallel to her own within the castle walls, each carrying their own duties, their own paths shaped by circumstance, each contributing in small ways to the larger fabric of the duchy. And in that realization, she felt a softening within her, a recognition that her own burdens, though heavy, were part of something broader, something that did not solely rest on her shoulders. She continued walking, eventually reaching a small alcove where a stone bench overlooked a narrow courtyard filled with herb sage, rosemary, mint, and others whose scents mingled into a soothing blend. The sunlight reached this courtyard later in the morning, so it still rested in a cool shade, the leaves of the plants glistening faintly with dew. She sat on the bench, letting the quiet of the place settle around her like a gentle embrace. From here, she could hear faint birdsong, delicate and scattered. A soft breeze slipped through the open arches, carrying with it the scent of the herbs and a hint of distant wood smoke from the kitchens. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting these gentle sensations gather around her, their simplicity offering a kind of rest that no lavish chamber ever could. She did not know how long she remained there, but when she opened her eyes again the shade had shifted slightly, the light inching closer to the herb beds. The day was advancing, though it did so with the same slow grace that the morning had carried from its first breath. She rose from the bench and began to make her way back toward the central halls, aware that her presence might soon be requested again. As she approached the main corridor, she heard the soft murmur of voices to ladies-in-waiting, discussing the arrangements for the afternoon, their tones respectful, but tinged with the everyday concerns of their duties. When they noticed her, they straightened quickly and bowed their heads. She offered them a small, reassuring smile before continuing past them. Her steps carried her toward the grand staircase, where sunlight pooled on the polished stone like a spill of gold. She descended slowly, one hand gliding lightly along the smooth banister. At the bottom, she paused again, letting her gaze sweep across the vast entry hall, where servants moved with purpose and quiet urgency. It was a living organism, this castle, breathing, waking, stretching into the day, and she, moving with calm certainty, felt herself part of its rhythm. The world outside these walls would continue shifting. Alliances would rise and fall, the demands of political life would persist, and history would carve its inexorable path forward. But within her, the stillness of the night's deep hours remained, a quiet thread of steadiness that she carried through each room, each corridor, each breath. And as she stepped forward again, ready to meet whatever the day offered, there was a soft, almost imperceptible shift in the air, something gentle and reassuring, as though the castle itself exhaled in quiet harmony with her movement. The subtle rustle of distant footsteps, the faint clink of metal carried on a wandering draught, and the warm murmur of voices drifted upward from the lower levels, each sound folding into the slow cadence of morning that enveloped every stone, every archway, every lingering shadow within the vast halls. She let her pace remain unhurried as she crossed the expanse of the entry hall, noticing how the sunlight from the high windows touched the floor in serene ribbons. Dust glimmered in the light like drifting fragments of old stories, moving gently in the stillness. Her eyes followed them for a moment, then continued onward, toward a smaller passage leading to the western wing, where the rooms grew quieter and the castle's heartbeat softened. The passage welcomed her with coolness and dimness. Here the windows were smaller, set deep into the walls, letting in only slender traces of light. The air smelled faintly of aged wood, dried lavender, and the distant aroma of parchment from the scriptorium somewhere further down. Her footsteps echoed quietly, not sharp enough to disturb the hush that had settled there, but steady enough to remind the space of her presence. As she passed the scriptorium, the faint scratching of quill on parchment brushed against her ears in a delicate whisper. Inside, scribes bent over their work, copying texts line by line, preserving knowledge with a patience that spanned hours, days, sometimes entire seasons. Their concentration felt almost sacred, as though the silent endurance of their work was a kind of devotion. She moved slowly past them, not wanting to break the spell of focus that lingered in that room. Beyond the scriptorium, the corridor opened into a narrower staircase, spiraling upward. She followed it, her hand gliding lightly along the smooth stone of the railing. The climb was easy, unhurried, and as she ascended, the hush deepened. By the time she reached the landing, it felt as though she had stepped very gently into a place untouched by urgency or expectation. This was the old tower chamber, one of the oldest parts of the castle. It was rarely visited now, except by those who appreciated its solitude. She pushed the wooden door open with care, and the hinges groaned softly, a familiar sound that seemed more like a greeting than a protest. Inside, the room was spacious yet sparsely furnished, its walls shaped by centuries of quiet endurance. Tall, narrow windows overlooked the countryside, framing views that stretched far into the distance. She crossed the room and approached one of the windows, where sunlight spilled across the stone floor like a warm invitation. Beyond the glass, the world opened into rolling fields touched with gold, forests shifting gently in the wind, and distant hills softened by the haze of morning. The sky above was clear, its pale blue deepening gradually toward the horizon where soft wisps of cloud drifted like slow thoughts. She rested her hands on the windowsill and leaned forward slightly, letting her gaze travel across the landscape. From up here, far above the bustle of the castle, everything looked calmer, more forgiving. The fields stretched in quiet continuity. Villages dotted the land in small, peaceful clusters, and there was a softness in the movement of the trees that felt like an unspoken reassurance. She stayed by the window for a while, breathing evenly, letting the stillness pool around her like gentle water. In the quiet, the memories of the past night's ceremony seemed distant, softened, almost blurred at the edges. They drifted through her mind like fragile echo-solemn words spoken beneath candlelight, the weight of expectation settling over her shoulders, the warm touch of loyalty from those who guided her through the ancient rites. Yet now, in the calm of the morning, these memories felt less like burdens and more like stepping stones, laid carefully on a long, winding path. Eventually she moved to the center of the room, letting her hand trail across the old wooden table worn by time. The surface carried faint mark scratches left by forgotten quills, the slight depressions where heavy books may have rested, and the ghost of ink stains that had never fully faded. She felt a quiet tenderness toward these small imperfections, each one a trace of the many lives that had passed through this space. She turned then toward a second window, one that faced the inner courtyard. From here, she could see the people moving far below, small figures weaving in and out of sunlight. Guards practiced their steady marches, servants crossed paths carrying baskets, and a pair of stable hands led to horses toward the lower gate. Everything unfolded with gentle rhythm, as if governed by the slow turning of an invisible clock. She watched them for a long moment, recognizing in their movements the deep familiarity of daily life. There was something comforting about the repetition, the same paths walked each morning, the same quiet duties fulfilled, the same soft rituals that shaped the beginning of each day. In this constancy, she found a sense of belonging, a quiet understanding that life within the castle flowed like a wide, steady river, carrying everyone forward with patient certainty. As she lingered there, a warm draught drifted through the room, brushing softly against her face. It carried the faint scent of blooming herbs from the courtyard, mingled with something lighter and cooler perhaps, the scent of early autumn beginning to gather on the horizon. The season was gently shifting, though the change was subtle. whispered in the crispness of the air and the golden tone of the sunlight. A sense of ease settled over her, deeper than before. She felt the day unfolding around her, not demanding anything but simply drifting forward with the same steady pace of her own breath. The weight she had carried for so long seemed lighter in this quiet tower, softened by the calm clarity of the morning. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peace of the space settle into her. When she opened them again, the sunlight had moved slightly across the floor, forming a warm glow beneath the window. She stepped into it, feeling the gentle heat rise through her shoes, warming the soles of her feet. It was a small comfort, but a grounding one, a reminder that even within ancient walls, the simple touch of sunlight could offer solace. She breathed in slowly, letting the air fill her chest with quiet assurance, and then breathed out just as gently. The rhythm steadied her, like a lullaby woven through the passing minutes. She let her gaze drift again to the landscape beyond the window. The fields shimmered faintly now as the sun climbed higher, and the distant hills seemed softer, as if wrapped in a thin veil of morning mist. Everything in the world appeared unhurried, resting in a gentle pause, and she allowed herself to rest within that pause too. Time slipped forward quietly. She remained by the window, her thoughts drifting like leaves carried by a slow-moving stream. She reflected not on decisions, not on duties, not on expectations, but simply on the stillness itself, the rare sweetness of a moment untouched by urgency. In that stillness, she felt something inside her settle, aligning softly with the calm morning. Eventually she stepped back from the window and returned to the center of the room, her movements slow and fluid. She touched the surface of the old table once more, then crossed the room toward the staircase. Before she left, she paused at the doorway, looking back at the tower chamber with a faint, thoughtful softness in her expression. The silence of the room held steady, as though it understood that she would return whenever she needed its peace. She descended the staircase slowly, letting the quiet wrap around her one final time before she reinterred the pulse of the castle below. And as she stepped back into the corridor, she felt lighter, steadier, her thoughts calm and clear, like water reflecting the morning sky. The castle greeted her, as it always did, with gentle echoes, soft light, and the quiet promise of another day unfolding just as patiently as all the days that had come before it. She moved forward through the hallway, her steps measured, her breathing soft, and the warmth of the sun filtering in through each passing window. Everything around her blended into a soothing harmony, voices muted, footsteps distant, doors opening and closing with soft thuds, and the hush of the morning lingering like a comforting whisper. She let herself flow with it, each moment settling carefully into the next, forming a calm continuum of quiet, steady life. And as she walked deeper into the heart of the castle, the peace of the morning wrapped around her like a soft, familiar cloak. The light, the air, the faint hum of daily tasks circling through the halls, all of it drifted together into a gentle, calming rhythm that felt almost like the world itself breathing with her. Nothing urged her forward, nothing pulled her back. She simply moved in a serene, unbroken line, embraced by the stillness of the old stone walls and the warm promise of the day. And in that slow, peaceful motion, the story of her morning, like so many mornings before, settled quietly into place, soft as a sigh, steady as a heartbeat, drifting onward in calm, unhurried peace.